This is a romance audiobook written and narrated by Rebecca Best. Settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself be swept away by a story of love, passion, and heartwarming moments. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy this romance audiobook.
Chapter 1. Lisa stood at the edge of the pitch at Eastvale United Stadium, her heart hammering in her chest. Beside her, Clara, her best friend and colleague, shifted nervously, arms folded tight across her chest. The roar of the crowd seemed to fade into a low hum, Lisa's entire focus locked on the penalty spot. The scoreboard glowed with the brutal reality, 2-1, in favor of the visitors, with just minutes left on the clock. Eastvale United was a soccer club based in the UK in East London, where she grew up. It was her beloved community's team, and this was the team's last chance to stay in the league. It all comes down to this. The whistle blew, signaling the moment that could change everything. The striker stepped up, positioning himself in front of the goal. Lisa could barely breathe as she watched the ball, her anxiety building with every passing second. "I can't take it. I can't watch," Clara muttered, squeezing her eyes shut. "Me neither," Lisa replied, but her eyes remained glued to the pitch. If they scored, the game would end in a draw, enough to avoid the team dropping into the lower league next season. But if they missed, she shuddered to think of the fallout. It wasn't just about the game. Football, or soccer as it's called in the US, was more than just a sport here in the UK. It was the heart of Eastvale. It was an economic lifeline, a source of local pride, and a way to bring people together. For anyone unfamiliar with football, it's a simple game at its core. 22 players are on the pitch at once, 11 on each side. There's one goal at each end of the field, and the aim is to use your feet to score more goals than the other team in 90 minutes. Such a straightforward concept, yet it has the power to mean so much to an entire community. "Please, please don't miss," Lisa silently begged. Her mind raced through all the things at stake. Eastvale United wasn't just about football. It was a symbol of hope. If they stayed in the league, the economic benefits would keep the local shops, pubs, and hotels thriving. It meant jobs, directly for those working at the club, but also for the small businesses that depended on matchday crowds. The youth programs would continue to grow, giving kids a chance to play and dream of futures in the sport. The community outreach programs she worked tirelessly to support could expand, helping at-risk teens find their footing through football. And then there was the social side, the way football brought everyone together, no matter their background. Lisa had seen firsthand how Eastvale United's existence fostered unity, how it helped bridge divides and fostered a sense of belonging. For some, this was their only escape from the hardships of daily life. Her gaze flickered to the VIP section, where Brandon Whitaker sat, the new owner of the club. An American, no less, with his clean-cut look and sharp suits. Now, there was nothing wrong with the fact that he was American. The problem was that, as an American, he had no real association with Eastvale United, or even the sport. The whispers were already swirling, rumors that he didn't understand the cultural significance of the club, that he was too focused on profits. He didn't call it football like they did here in the UK. He called it soccer, just like they did back in the States. That difference, though small, seemed to represent so much more to her. Would someone who called it soccer ever truly understand what Eastvale United meant? Could someone so business-minded, so distant from the passion and history of the community, ever care about more than the bottom line? He's probably just waiting to make his changes, Lisa thought bitterly, her stomach twisting at the idea. She'd heard whispers, rumors that he planned to raise ticket prices, make the club more profitable, at the expense of the very people who kept it alive. But could she blame him? Football was woven into the fabric of everyday life. It was local, it was intimate, it was personal. Lisa knew that if the team went down today, if they were relegated, it would give Brandon every excuse he needed to make changes. And that meant Eastvale United might lose the very things that made it special. The striker shifted his weight, and the stadium collectively held its breath. "Come on, you've got this." Lisa clenched her fists, every nerve in her body taut. So much depended on this moment. The striker ran up, his foot connecting with the ball. It sailed through the air, a clean, powerful shot. Time seemed to slow as the ball headed toward the top left corner of the net. The goalkeeper lunged. A gasp echoed through the stands. The world around Lisa froze as she waited to see where the ball would land, waiting to see if her beloved Eastvale United would survive the day. Time seemed to stretch as the ball sailed through the air, spinning toward the top left corner of the net. Lisa held her breath, her nails digging into the palms of her hands as she waited for the outcome. The goalkeeper stretched, his fingertips grazing the ball. But not enough. The ball hit the back of the net with a satisfying thud. "Yes!" Lisa shouted, her voice barely cutting through the explosion of noise around her. Clara grabbed her arm, jumping up and down with excitement, her earlier nerves completely forgotten. "We did it! We actually did it!" The crowd erupted into chaos, a sea of red and white as Eastvale United fans celebrated the goal that had saved their season. Strangers hugged each other, scarves waved in the air, and the chant of "Eastvale, Eastvale," rippled through the stadium like a victory anthem. Lisa felt the overwhelming joy of relief wash over her. It was more than just the fact that they'd scored. It was what the goal represented. The club wasn't going down, not today. The community she cared so much about would have another chance, and for a moment, the weight of everything that had been hanging over her felt lighter. "Clara, can you believe it?" Lisa grinned, still breathless from shouting. Clara shook her head, laughing. "Barely. I thought I was going to pass out from stress. But now, this is everything." They both turned to watch the team huddling together on the pitch, celebrating as though they'd won the game. The scoreboard showed the draw, 2-2. But to Eastvale United, it might as well have been a victory. The whistle blew shortly afterward, signaling the end of the match, but the celebrations in the stands continued unabated. Lisa looked around, feeling the pure energy of the crowd, the palpable sense of relief and elation. It was moments like this that reminded her why she cared so deeply about the club. Football wasn't just a game. It was a lifeline for the people here, a source of pride and belonging. As the noise of the fans swirled around her, Lisa turned to Clara, her smile wide. "We needed this." "We did," Clara agreed, looping her arm through Lisa's as they both took in the euphoric atmosphere. "I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be this happy about football." The team huddled together on the pitch, celebrating as though they had won, even though the scoreboard showed a draw. The whistle blew, signaling the end of the match, but the celebrations in the stands carried on. Lisa stood, absorbing the joy and relief of the moment. The crowd. This was why she fought so hard for Eastvale United, because it meant everything to these people. Football wasn't just a game here. It was survival, hope, and pride. As the crowd began to trickle out, Lisa's gaze wandered back to the VIP section. Brandon stood, talking with some officials, his expression unreadable. There was something about the way he looked at the stadium, detached, calculating, that sent a chill through her. She didn't trust him, not with the future of Eastvale United, and certainly not with the future of the community she loved so much. As the players left the field and the stadium started to empty, Lisa turned to Clara. "I just hope he understands what this club really means. If he doesn't, we're in trouble." Clara gave her a sympathetic look. "I wouldn't count on him seeing it our way, but we'll just have to make him." Lisa nodded, though unease still churned in her stomach. The match was over, but the real battle, keeping Brandon from turning the club into a profit-making machine at the expense of the community, was just beginning.
We're so happy you're still with us. If you're enjoying this romance audiobook, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you'll be notified whenever we release more romance audiobook stories like this. We'd love for you to join us again in the future. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and now let's get back to the story.
Chapter 2. Brandon Whitaker entered the post-match reception, the lingering buzz of the stadium still ringing in his ears. He hadn't expected to be caught up in so much passion today. When he purchased this club, the only thing he had in mind was business, which meant profits, deals, and maximizing entertainment value. Yet here, in this corner of East London, football, or soccer, as he still thought of it, was something else entirely. He adjusted his suit jacket, scanning the room. The VIP area buzzed with club officials, community leaders, and local business owners, all eager to get a sense of his plans for Eastvale United. His mind, however, was already spinning through the numbers. The draw today had saved them from relegation, but it was a temporary reprieve. The club needed more than just luck. It needed to be transformed into a profitable, competitive entity. This wasn't his first rodeo. He had made his billions by purchasing and increasing the value of digital media and broadcasting businesses in the U.S. What he knew better than most was how to take an undervalued asset and turn it into something worth 10 times the original investment. This was his first time venturing into the sports world, but the appeal was undeniable. Buying Eastvale United for around $300 million was a steal. In a few years, with the right sponsorship deals and broadcast rights, the club could be worth $2 to $3 billion. And then he could consider an exit. For Brandon, soccer wasn't just a game. It was a lucrative opportunity. He didn't follow a particular team, but owning one? That would make the sport much more fun and was a great way to find new potential business partners to work with. The exclusivity of owning a club was part of the allure. It was a ticket to the kind of rooms where decisions that shaped industries were made. As he scanned the room, his thoughts were interrupted by a voice. "Mr. Whitaker?" He turned to see a young brunette with striking green eyes. She looked familiar. Ah, yes, she had been by the pitch earlier, nervously watching the game. The clipboard in her hand indicated she was more than just another guest at the reception. "Yes, that's me," Brandon replied with a polite smile, extending his hand. "And you are?" "Lisa Davies," she said, shaking his hand. "I run the community outreach program for the club." Ah, community outreach. Important to the locals, sure, but not exactly high on Brandon's list of priorities. His focus was on growing the bottom line. "Pleasure to meet you, Lisa. I've heard a lot about the work you're doing here," Brandon said, though his mind was already drifting back to potential revenue streams, premium seating, corporate sponsorships, broadcast rights. Lisa's eyes narrowed, as if sensing his lack of genuine interest. "It's not just work. It's the heart of this club," she said firmly. Eastvale United isn't just about football to the people around here. It's their identity, their connection to something bigger. I hope that's something you'll take into consideration." Brandon raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the intensity of her words. "I understand that the community is important, but the club can't survive on goodwill alone. We need to be profitable if we want to keep the doors open." Lisa crossed her arms, clearly unyielding. "Of course, but there has to be a balance. If we focus too much on profit, we risk losing the very people who make this club what it is." He felt a flicker of admiration for her. She wasn't backing down. He liked that. But he also couldn't let her idealism blind him to the reality of running a successful business. "I get that," Brandon said, his tone measured. "But if we don't bring in more revenue, there won't be a club for the community to support. This is my first venture into sports, but I've spent years growing businesses, and I've seen how important it is to turn undervalued assets into competitive, profitable entities. This club has untapped potential." Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. "So you've done this before, in America?" Brandon smiled wryly. "Not with soccer clubs, but with digital media and broadcasting companies. I've built them from the ground up, turning them into multi-billion-dollar enterprises. Sports, particularly soccer, offers similar commercial opportunities. The key is to maximize those opportunities while staying competitive on the field." Lisa's eyes twinkled with a hint of amusement. "We don't call it soccer. It's football here, Mr. Whitaker. But I guess we'll work on that." He chuckled, realizing she had caught him in his Americanism. "Touché, I'll get it right next time." Their conversation lightened with the shared joke, but the tension between them remained. Lisa was clearly someone who cared deeply about the community aspect of the club, while he, of course, was focused on the bigger financial picture. But something about her intrigued him. Maybe it was her unwavering passion or the way she challenged him. Brandon found himself watching her more closely. She was different from the people he usually dealt with, direct, no nonsense, and committed to something bigger than just profits. There was a fire in her, one that made him both frustrated and intrigued. He had to admit, there was something about her that held his attention. She didn't fit into the mold of the polished, business-focused individuals he normally worked with, and that alone made him curious. "Well, Miss Davies," he said, offering her a polite nod. "I'm sure we'll find a way to balance things out." "I hope so." Lisa replied, her tone softening, though her eyes still held a flicker of wariness, for the sake of the club and the people who depend on it. Brandon watched her as she walked away, his mind lingering on their exchange. Lisa wasn't like anyone he had met before, and that was unsettling in its own way. But it was also intriguing. There was something about her that made him pause, made him reconsider how simple this deal would be. For now, he'd focus on the business, but something told him this wouldn't be the last time Lisa Davies got under his skin. Chapter 3. Lisa leaned against the counter in the staff room, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her notebook. Her conversation with Brandon Whitaker kept replaying in her mind. She'd dealt with men like him before, wealthy, business-driven, focused solely on the bottom line. Money and status didn't impress her. They never had. But something about Brandon was different. Something about him left her intrigued. "Earth to Lisa," Clara's voice broke through her thoughts. Lisa blinked, shaking her head as if to clear the fog of her daydreams. "Sorry, just thinking." Clara perched herself on the edge of the table, a knowing look in her eyes. "Thinking about our new boss? Huh?" Lisa rolled her eyes, but she couldn't suppress the small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I don't know what it is. He's so business-focused. It's like he doesn't even care about what this club means to the community." Clara raised an eyebrow. "But he clearly cares about something, doesn't he? Otherwise, you wouldn't be so distracted." Lisa huffed and crossed her arms. "I'm not distracted. He doesn't get it. He's too focused on profits and sponsorships. He even called it soccer, for crying out loud." Clara's grin widened. "Did you correct him?" "I did, and he actually seemed to find it funny." Lisa's smile faded as she thought about the exchange. "But it's not just that. It's his whole mentality. Football means more than just money to people here. It's history, tradition, community." Clara nodded, leaning in slightly. "And yet, he's not entirely terrible, is he? You didn't seem to think so during your chat." Lisa hesitated, her mind drifting back to the way Brandon had smiled at her, the way his eyes had lingered just a bit too long. Had he been interested in her? No, she was probably reading too much into it. She didn't want to misinterpret a polite interaction as anything more. And yet, there had been a moment when it felt like something was there, like maybe he was drawn to her too. "I mean, he's charming, I guess," Lisa finally admitted, her tone careful. "But that doesn't change the fact that he's here to turn this club into a money-making machine." "Maybe." Clara's voice took on a teasing note. "But maybe there's more to him than just business. He could surprise you." Lisa gave her a skeptical look. "Surprise me? Clara, have you heard the rumors? There's talk that he's planning to raise ticket prices and make the games more exclusive. That's exactly what I was afraid of." Clara sighed and placed a comforting hand on Lisa's arm. "I know you're worried about the changes, but you can't jump to conclusions about him. Just because he wears sharp suits and is focused on finances doesn't mean he's heartless." Lisa bit her lip, Clara's words sinking in. She had a point, but the idea of Eastvale United becoming inaccessible to the very people who depended on it made her stomach churn. And yet, there was something else gnawing at her. A curiosity about whether Brandon might have felt a spark between them, the same way she had. But how could she know for sure? She couldn't risk misreading the situation, putting herself out there, only to find out it was all in her head. "And there's that other thing," Clara added, her voice dipping conspiratorially. Lisa frowned. "What other thing?" Clara glanced around the room before lowering her voice. "His ex, Selena Carrington. Haven't you heard the gossip?" Lisa's heart sank a little. "His ex?" Clara nodded. "Yeah, apparently she was involved in brokering the deal for him to buy the club." Of course, someone like Brandon wouldn't just waltz in on his own. There was always a story behind the scenes, and it seemed his ex, Selena, played a big role. "Let me guess. She's high society, right?" Clara smirked. "You got it. Fancy parties, big business deals, the whole package." Lisa tried to brush it off, but the thought of Brandon's ex being involved made her feel small. She was used to being around wealth and power, but that didn't mean she felt like she belonged. Knowing that someone like Brandon had an ex who was so deeply embedded in that world only made it harder to reconcile the growing curiosity she had about him. "Well, that's just perfect," Lisa muttered, crossing her arms tighter. "Another reason to keep my distance." Clara shook her head. giving Lisa a sympathetic smile. Or maybe it's just another reason to see that there's more to Brandon than what you think. Lisa wasn't sure. She'd been burned before, and the last thing she wanted was to let her guard down around someone like him. But despite her best efforts to push him out of her mind, Brandon lingered there, a quiet distraction she couldn't quite shake. As the conversation with Clara wound down, Lisa stared out the window, her thoughts still swirling. No matter how much she tried to convince herself that her wariness was justified, the truth was clear. Brandon Whitaker had left a mark on her, and whether she liked it or not, it wasn't going to fade easily. Chapter 4. Lisa stood in front of her car, checking her clipboard for the day's schedule. The community outreach program meant driving around different neighborhoods, meeting people face-to-face, and listening to their concerns. She loved these days, being out and seeing the real impact Eastvale United had on the community. But today, there was an unexpected twist. Brandon Whitaker was joining her. She'd only found out an hour ago, and the idea of spending the entire day with him made her stomach churn. He wasn't exactly her first choice of company. She could already imagine the conversations turning toward sponsorships, revenue streams, and worst of all, ticket prices. The club didn't need more corporate interference. It needed someone who understood what football meant to this community. As she mentally prepared herself, Clara popped up beside her, grinning from ear to ear. "So, I hear you've got a co-pilot today." Lisa rolled her eyes. "Unfortunately. Apparently, Brandon thought today would be a great time to see the community firsthand." Clara snickered. "You mean he wants to talk about profits while you're trying to meet with families?" "Exactly," Lisa muttered. She glanced at the schedule again, more out of habit than necessity. "It's going to be a long day." Clara elbowed her playfully. "Or maybe not. Maybe today's the day you realize that the business tycoon isn't all bad." Lisa shot her a skeptical look. "I doubt it. He's all spreadsheets and profit margins. He's not interested in what really matters here." Clara winked. "Well, we'll see. Stranger things have happened." Before Lisa could respond, she heard the unmistakable rumble of an expensive engine. She turned to see Brandon's sleek black Bentley pull up next to her. Of course, he'd drive something flashy like that. The thought of that luxury car pulling up in front of the community center made her cringe a little. It wasn't exactly subtle. Brandon stepped out, looking sharp in his tailored suit, though he ditched the tie, making him seem slightly more relaxed. "Morning, Lisa," he greeted with a smile. "Ready to hit the road?" "Morning," Lisa replied, trying to keep her tone neutral. "I didn't realize you'd be joining us today." Brandon raised an eyebrow. "I thought it would be a good idea to get out there and see the impact for myself. I've heard a lot about the community program, but it's different when you're on the ground." She couldn't argue with that. "Well, we'll be covering a lot of ground today. We're heading into some of the lower income areas, meeting with families and local business owners." She gestured to the clipboard. "It's important they feel connected to the club." Brandon nodded thoughtfully, but before he could say anything, another car door slammed. Lisa looked over and saw a man approaching them, tall, sharp-featured, with a calculating gaze. She immediately guessed this was Jake, the financial advisor Clara had mentioned. "Brandon?" Jake said with a nod, completely ignoring Lisa at first. "I've been reviewing the latest projections for the club. We need to talk about those sponsorship deals we discussed last week." Brandon gave a brief nod, but waved him off. "We'll deal with it later, Jake. Today's about the community." Jake's expression faltered slightly, as if he wasn't used to being brushed aside, but he recovered quickly. "Of course, I'll touch base with you afterward." As Jake walked away, Lisa couldn't help but feel a little victorious. At least for today, Brandon seemed focused on the right things. "So," Brandon said, turning back to her, "shall we take my car? It'll be more comfortable." Lisa glanced at the Bentley and couldn't help the giggle that escaped her. I don't think a Bentley is exactly the best choice for where we're going." Brandon looked puzzled for a moment before realizing what she meant. "Right? A bit flashy, huh?" "A little," she teased, her smile widening. "I think we'll stick with something more discreet. My car will do just fine." Brandon chuckled, holding his hands up in surrender. "All right, I'll follow your lead." Lisa gave him a nod, walking over to her car. a modest, practical vehicle that blended in with the neighborhood they were heading to. She hopped into the driver's seat, feeling a small sense of satisfaction as Brandon slid into the passenger seat. It wasn't often she got to take the lead, especially with someone like him. They both climbed into her modest hatchback, the contrast between their worlds becoming glaringly obvious. As Lisa pulled out of the parking lot, she could feel the tension and proximity simmering between them. Lisa couldn't help but wonder how the day would go. Spending an entire day with Brandon Whitaker was bound to be interesting. She only hoped she wouldn't end up talking about ticket prices or sponsorships too much. But maybe, just maybe, she'd get a glimpse of the man behind the business. Only time would tell. The car hummed softly as Lisa drove through the familiar streets of East London. The morning light filtered through the trees lining the roads, and the city was beginning to stir with life. Lisa glanced over at Brandon, who seemed surprisingly relaxed in the passenger seat. He had an open, curious expression as he looked out the window, taking in everything around him. "So," Lisa said, breaking the silence, "you're diving in at the deep end today. I hope you're ready. The people we're going to meet aren't shy. They're going to want to get to know you." Brandon smiled, his eyes still fixed on the passing buildings. "That's exactly why I wanted to come. I've been looking forward to seeing the neighborhood for myself, getting to know the people who make it what it is." Lisa raised an eyebrow. She hadn't expected that response. Most people wouldn't be as excited about meeting a bunch of strangers and fielding endless questions. "Well," Brandon shrugged lightly, "there's only so much you can learn from a distance. I want to hear their stories, see what this place means to them. That's what I've been missing so far." Lisa gave a small, approving nod as they continued to drive. "You'll get plenty of stories, that's for sure. East London is rich in history. Every corner has a tale to tell, and the people here are proud of where they come from." As they passed a row of small shops, Lisa pointed out a local cafe. "We'll be stopping there later. The owners have been around forever, and they're some of the club's most devoted supporters. You'll see how deeply they care about what happens here." Brandon followed her gaze to the cafe, where people bustled in and out, greeting one another as they passed. It was a world away from the places he usually frequented, but there was something comforting about it. The sense of connection was palpable. "Have you been doing this for long?" Brandon asked, turning back to her. "Since I started working with the club," Lisa replied. "It's one of my favorite parts of the job. I usually bring a couple of the players with me. They blend in right away. Most of them either grew up in places like this or have similar backgrounds. It makes a difference when people see familiar faces." Brandon smiled softly, appreciating her commitment. "It sounds like you really know the community." Lisa nodded. "I do. These are good people. They've been through a lot, but they're strong. The club has always been more than just football to them. It's something that ties them together." They turned a corner, and Lisa pointed out a small school. "That's one of the schools we work with. The kids there are great. They're full of energy and always excited when we visit. Some of the boys on the team even came through that school. It's one of those places that's small, but it has a big heart." Brandon looked out at the schoolyard, where kids were already out kicking a football around. He couldn't help but smile. "You can feel the energy, even from here." Lisa smiled too. "Yeah, it's special. These kids dream big. They see the players as role models, and it gives them something to aim for. We try to nurture that as much as we can." The car rolled on through the winding streets, and Brandon took it all in. The shops, the people, the sense of pride that seemed to fill the air. He had expected to be an observer today, but he found himself eager to get involved, to meet the people Lisa spoke about with such affection. They passed by a community center, and Lisa slowed the car a little. "We'll stop there later, too. They run a lot of youth programs, and the club helps sponsor a few. It's a place where kids can come after school and stay out of trouble. It's really important to the neighborhood." Brandon nodded, still absorbing everything. "It seems like everywhere we go, the club's connected in some way." "It is," Lisa replied. "That's what makes it special. Eastvale United isn't just about what happens on the pitch. It's woven into the fabric of the community. People here rely on it for more than just entertainment. It gives them hope. They drove in silence for a few moments, both of them taking in the surroundings. Brandon was starting to understand just how much this place meant to the people who lived here. He could feel the sense of pride and belonging in the air, and it was contagious. Suddenly, Lisa pulled into a small parking lot outside a local clothing store. Brandon gave her a puzzled look. "Why have we stopped here?" Lisa grinned as she unbuckled her seatbelt. "You're going to need a quick wardrobe change." Brandon looked down at his casual but still highly tailored outfit. "I thought I dressed down today." Lisa laughed. "You did, but not quite enough. Trust me, if you show up at these places looking too polished, it's going to be hard to connect. We need to get you looking a little more grounded." Brandon raised his hands in mock surrender. "All right, you're the boss. What do I need?" "Jeans and some casual shoes should do the trick," Lisa said, still grinning. They walked into the store, and Lisa wasted no time picking out a few things for him. Brandon watched with amusement as she selected a pair of jeans and a simple pair of black sneakers. A few minutes later, Brandon emerged from the changing room in his new outfit. "Well?" Lisa gave him an approving nod. "Much better. Now you look like someone who belongs here." Brandon glanced at himself in the mirror, noticing how much less out of place he felt already. "Not bad," he admitted. They headed back to the car, and as they pulled out of the parking lot, Lisa pointed out a few more places along the way: a local bakery, a park where the community often gathered, and finally the hospital they were set to visit. "Each stop has its own story," she said as they drove. "These people, these places, they're all part of what makes East London what it is." Brandon nodded, more eager than ever to meet the people she spoke of. He wasn't sure what he'd expected when he agreed to join her today, but he knew it wasn't this. He was starting to see the community not just as an abstract idea, but as something real, something alive. As they approached their first stop, Brandon glanced at Lisa. "Thanks for bringing me along. I'm looking forward to getting to know this place." Lisa smiled softly. "You're welcome. Just be yourself and listen. That's all you need to do." Brandon leaned back in his seat, feeling strangely at ease. Maybe today wasn't just about meeting the community. It was about finding his own connection to it. And with Lisa by his side, he had a feeling it was going to be a day he wouldn't forget. Chapter 5. Brandon adjusted the collar of his new jacket as he followed Lisa into the small cafe. The moment they stepped inside, the smell of fresh pastries and strong coffee hit him, a welcome change from the sterile environments he was used to in his usual high-end meetings. The locals were already filling up the tables, chatting and laughing as the morning sun streamed through the large windows. Lisa greeted the owners, an older couple, with a warm smile that immediately put everyone at ease. Brandon stood back, observing as she made her way from table to table, checking in on familiar faces. He was enchanted by how seamlessly she moved through the room, her easy rapport with the people, her laughter filling the space. Everyone seemed to know her, and she had a way of making each person feel seen and heard. Brandon's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than he intended. There was something about the way she lit up when she spoke to people, how genuine her care was for the community. It was infectious, and before he knew it, he found himself smiling along with the locals. "Brandon," Lisa called, waving him over. "Come meet Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. They've been supporting the club for over 50 years. Brandon walked over, shaking their hands with a polite smile. "It's nice to meet you both." 50 years, that's quite a commitment." Mrs. Thompson beamed at him, her eyes twinkling with pride. "Well, we've seen the club through its ups and downs. It's been the heart of this place for as long as I can remember." Brandon nodded, absorbing her words. "I'm starting to see that." They chatted for a while longer, and as the conversation flowed, Brandon noticed Lisa watching him with a hint of surprise. He wasn't sure if she had expected him to stumble through these interactions, but he had to admit he felt more at ease here than he thought he would. Maybe it was the charm of the neighborhood, or maybe it was just Lisa's presence that made everything feel easier. After the cafe, they made their way to a local secondary school where Lisa had arranged to meet some of the students. As they walked through the corridors, Brandon couldn't help but admire how much effort she put into these visits. I usually do these rounds with 1 or 2 players, Lisa mentioned as they approached the gym. The kids love it when they see familiar faces from the team. A lot of them look up to the players. I can see why, Brandon replied. The players are from the same backgrounds. It must mean a lot to the kids to see people who made it, knowing they came from the same place. Lisa nodded. Exactly. It gives them hope, something to aim for. They entered the gym, where a group of kids were already practicing their football skills. The moment Lisa stepped inside, the kids cheered, running over to greet her. Brandon watched as she knelt down, talking to them at eye level, asking about their day, and complimenting their football moves. Her warmth radiated, and it was clear these kids adored her. Brandon joined the conversation, and soon enough he found himself passing a football back and forth with a few of the boys. Laughter echoed through the gym, and for a moment he forgot all about the formalities and the pressures of his world. Here, it was just about having fun, connecting with the people around him. As they left the school, Lisa looked over at him, her expression soft. You're pretty good with the kids. Brandon shrugged, smiling. I guess it's easier when you're not trying to close a deal. She laughed, the sound light and genuine. I wasn't sure how today was going to go, but I have to say, you've surprised me. Good surprise, I hope? He asked, though he could already tell from the way she smiled that it was. Yeah, she admitted. A good one. After leaving the school, Lisa suggested they stop for lunch at a cozy Turkish restaurant down the road, Anatolia's Corner. The vibrant mosaic lanterns hanging in the windows cast colorful reflections on the sidewalk, and the scent of grilling meats and freshly baked bread filled the air as they stepped inside. This place is one of my favorites, Lisa said with a grin. I've been coming here for years. Metin, the owner, is practically family to everyone around here. The moment they walked in, they were greeted by a tall, broad-shouldered man with a warm smile and a thick mustache. He wore a traditional apron, and his eyes lit up when he saw Lisa. Ah, Lisa! Welcome, welcome! Mean exclaimed, pulling her into a brief but hearty hug. His attention shifted to Brandon, and he extended his hand. And who is this fine gentleman? This is Brandon, Lisa introduced, smiling warmly. He's new to the area. Ah, welcome to Anatolia's Corner, Brandon. You're in for a treat today, Metin said with pride as he shook Brandon's hand. I'll get you the best food this side of Istanbul. Metin led them to a table near the back of the restaurant, which was decorated with intricately patterned rugs on the walls and delicate lanterns hanging from the ceiling. The atmosphere was inviting and intimate, the kind of place where everyone felt like family. I'll bring out a little of everything, Metin said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. You won't leave hungry, I promise. As Metin disappeared into the kitchen, Brandon glanced around, taking in the details. The restaurant was bustling with the lunch crowd, but the pace was relaxed. Customers greeted one another as if they were old friends, and the air was filled with the sound of cheerful conversation. You really seem to know everyone, Brandon said with a chuckle, tearing off a piece of warm pita bread from the basket Metin had brought over. Lisa smiled, dipping her bread into a small dish of olive oil and sumac. It's hard not to when you spend as much time in the community as I do. Metin's been here for over 20 years. He's one of those people who always supports the club, whether it's donating food for events or just being there when someone needs a friendly face. Brandon nodded, clearly impressed. It's a special place. I'm starting to see why you love it here so much. East London's full of places like this, Lisa explained. It's more than just the food or the shops, it's the people. Everyone looks out for each other. It's like a big, extended family. Brandon leaned back in his chair, watching as Lisa spoke with such passion about the neighborhood. He could feel the connection she had to this place, and it made him appreciate it even more. Metin returned with a large platter of mezzi, grilled halloumi, hummus, baba ganoush, and stuffed grape leaves. The colors and aromas were mouth-watering, and Brandon couldn't help but smile at the spread. This is a feast, Brandon said, laughing in surprise as Metin laid down even more dishes. How do you finish all of this? Lisa chuckled, reaching for a piece of grilled halloumi. I never do. That's the secret. I always leave with a doggy bag, and I've got enough for dinner tomorrow. Brandon grinned. Smart. I might have to start doing that. I wasn't expecting this much food. Oh, this is just the beginning, Lisa said with a playful wink. Metin loves feeding people. He always overdoes it, but you get used to it. Metin, overhearing the conversation, laughed heartily as he placed more food on the table. In my family, we believe no one should ever leave the table hungry. You're part of the family now, Brandon, so eat up. Brandon took a bite of the grilled halloumi, the salty, smoky flavor hitting his taste buds. This is incredible, he said, his eyes widening in appreciation. You weren't kidding about the food. Lisa laughed as she dipped her bread into some hummus. I told you, it's impossible to leave this place hungry. As they continued to eat, the conversation flowed easily. Lisa told Brandon more about the different areas they had visited that morning, sharing stories about the local families, the small businesses, and how the club's outreach had touched their lives. As they shared more of the meal, Metin brought out lamb kebabs, grilled vegetables, and fluffy rice. Brandon found himself completely immersed in the experience, not just because of the incredible food, but because of the way Lisa's energy seemed to infuse every moment. Her passion for the community, her connection to the people, he couldn't help but be impressed. You're really invested in this place, Brandon said, his tone thoughtful. It's not just about the job for you, is it? Lisa looked at him, her eyes softening. No, it's never been just a job. It's a part of who I am. The people here, the way they come together, how they support each other, it's something special. I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. Brandon found himself admiring her more with every word she spoke. There was something so genuine, so authentic about the way she cared for the people here. It was infectious, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was part of something real. I can see why this place means so much to you, Brandon said, his voice quieter now. And I have to admit, I'm really enjoying getting to know it. Lisa smiled, clearly touched by his words. I'm glad. It's easy to fall in love with a place like this. Metin returned to clear the plates, beaming when Brandon praised the meal. I told you, didn't I? Best food in East London. You weren't wrong, Brandon laughed. I think I might need to come back here regularly. You are always welcome, my friend, Metin said, patting Brandon on the shoulder before heading back to the kitchen. As they left the restaurant, Lisa carried a small bag with leftovers, laughing as she glanced at it. Told you? Enough for tomorrow. Brandon shook his head, amused. I'll have to remember that next time. They both laughed as they made their way back to the car. The warmth of the community, the way everyone seemed to know and care for one another, it was a stark contrast to the world Brandon usually operated in. And Lisa? She was at the center of it all, making it look effortless. You know, Brandon said as they walked back to the car, I didn't expect to enjoy today as much as I have. Lisa glanced at him, her smile soft. I wasn't sure you would either, but you've surprised me. Good surprise, I hope? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Yeah, she admitted, looking up at him with a playful glint in her eyes. A good one. As they got back in the car, Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between them. The attraction he'd been trying to keep at bay was growing stronger, and judging by the way Lisa looked at him, she felt it too. After their meal at the restaurant, Brandon and Lisa made their way to a local community center where the club had organized a small event to meet the winners of the recent Eastvale United giveaway. The first stop was a meet and greet with the winners. The room buzzed with excitement as 3 fans eagerly waited. Lisa greeted them with a warm smile while Brandon signed a few t-shirts. This one's for you, mate, Brandon said, handing a signed club t-shirt to a young man named Joe, who couldn't stop grinning. Thanks, this is amazing, Joe beamed, clutching the shirt like a prized possession. Another winner, a teenage girl with sparkling eyes named Maya, was up next. You don't know how much this means to me, she said, hugging the signed shirt Brandon handed her. The final prize winner, an older gentleman named Mr. Carter, shook Brandon's hand firmly. I've been supporting this club for decades, and this t-shirt and the season ticket for next season, well, that's something special. Brandon chuckled. We'll see you in the stands then? Mr. Carter nodded, his eyes glistening. Absolutely. Wouldn't miss it for the world. With the giveaway event concluded, Lisa led Brandon to the next stop, a local nursing home. The moment they entered, a wave of recognition swept through the residents. Lisa, one of the elderly ladies exclaimed, reaching out to hug her. "It's so good to see you again, dear. Have you brought one of the new players with you?" Brandon stifled a laugh as Lisa blushed slightly. No, this is Brandon Whitaker. He's the new owner of the club," she corrected gently, smiling at the group. "Oh, the owner?" Another resident chimed in. "Well, he looks fit enough to be out there on the field." Brandon smiled, shaking hands with the residents. He couldn't help but feel touched by how warmly they welcomed him. "Maybe one day," he joked, causing a ripple of laughter to spread through the group. Lisa and Brandon spent a bit more time chatting with the residents, sharing stories about the club's history, before finally making their way out for their final stop of the day. As they made their way to the car, Brandon turned to Lisa. "So, where to next?" Lisa gave him a mischievous grin. "We're headed to the Cleves Arms, the local pub." Brandon raised an eyebrow, amusement dancing in his eyes. "When you say a pub, that's what you Brits call a bar, right? So, are pub visits part of the job too?" Lisa chuckled. "I won't tell the boss if you won't," she teased, nudging him lightly with her elbow. "I don't know how you do things over in the States, but over here, a pub is where communities gather to eat lunch, drink beer, and have important discussions with friends and family. Today, we're meeting some of the senior members of the Supporters Club to discuss ideas for a new section in the club magazine. It's something I've been working on for a while." "Ah, so it's work after all," Brandon quipped. "Sort of," Lisa admitted with a smile. "We take turns on where to meet. Sometimes it's at the Eastvale offices, but today it's their turn, so we're meeting at their home ground, the Cleves Arms. You'll see what I mean when we get there. The pub is practically a shrine to Eastvale United. Fans gather there before and after every match." Brandon's curiosity was piqued. "So this is part of the local culture too, huh?" "You'll see," Lisa replied with a grin. "Just wait until you meet the members. They're all big personalities, but they're great guys. Promise they'll go easy on you, at least for today." When they pulled up to the Cleves Arms, Brandon took in the sight of the old brick building. It stood proudly on the corner, its windows framed by hanging flower baskets, and the sign above the door displayed the pub's name in bold gold letters. Outside, a few groups of regulars chatted animatedly, their scarves and hats proudly showing off Eastvale United's red and white colors. Inside, the pub was warm and inviting, the air thick with the scent of wood polish and ale. Every inch of the walls was covered with memorabilia from the club's history: scarves, signed jerseys, and framed photos of legendary players from decades past. Banners hung from the ceiling, some faded from years of matchday celebrations. On the far side of the room was a large mural of the Eastvale United Stadium, surrounded by images of cheering fans. "It's like a museum in here," Brandon commented, clearly impressed. Lisa nodded. "Told you. It's where fans come together to celebrate wins and commiserate over losses. On match days, it's packed to the rafters." They spotted the 3 members of the Supporters Club seated at a table near the back. The men, in their late 40s and early 50s, waved them over with enthusiastic smiles. One of them, a tall man with a bushy beard and glasses, stood up to greet them. "Brandon Whitaker, welcome," he said, shaking Brandon's hand firmly. "I'm Steve Harris, head of the Eastvale Supporters Forum, and these 2 troublemakers are Gary and Neil," he added, gesturing to the others. "Pleased to meet you," Brandon replied, shaking their hands as they all exchanged warm greetings. Gary, a short man with a broad grin, patted Brandon on the back. "Don't worry, mate. We'll go easy on you today," he said with a wink. Neil, the oldest of the group, sat back in his chair, folding his arms. "We've been hearing a lot about you, Brandon. We've got a few things to discuss, but first, let's get a pint in, eh?" They all laughed as Steve flagged down the bartender, who immediately began pouring pints of the pub's signature ale. Once the drinks were settled, the conversation turned to the club magazine. "We're excited about this new section in the magazine," Steve said. "It's about time the supporters had more of a voice. We've got plenty of stories to tell, and the fans need to feel heard, you know?" Brandon nodded thoughtfully. "I agree. The club wouldn't be what it is without its supporters, and we want to make sure your input is part of what drives the club forward." "That's exactly it," Neil said, raising his glass. "We've been following this club for decades, through thick and thin. It's more than just football, it's family." As they continued to talk, Brandon found himself more and more engaged in the conversation. The men shared their ideas for the magazine, stories about longtime fans, behind-the-scenes looks at match days, and even a Fan of the Month feature. They spoke passionately about the club's history and the importance of preserving its roots while looking to the future. "Sounds like we've got a lot of good ideas to work with," Brandon said. "I'll make sure we get these included in the next edition." By the time the conversation began winding down, the sun was setting outside, casting a golden glow through the pub's windows. The three men finished their drinks and stood to leave. "Well, we'll leave you two to enjoy the rest of your evening," Steve said with a smile. "We'll be in touch about that magazine." "Thanks for the chat, Brandon," Steve added, giving him another hearty pat on the back before they all said their goodbyes. As the door swung shut behind them, Lisa and Brandon were left alone at the table. The pub had quieted down as the evening wore on, but a few regulars still lingered, sharing stories of old games and laughing over pints. Brandon leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, that wasn't as bad as I thought," Lisa laughed. "See? I told you they'd go easy on you." He shook his head, still smiling. "It's clear this place is more than just a club. It's everything." Lisa nodded, her gaze softening as she looked around the pub. "Yeah, it's home." Chapter 6. The familiar hum of conversation and clinking glasses filled the Cleaves' arms, wrapping Brandon in a sense of warmth and belonging he hadn't felt in a long time. He'd been to enough high-end lounges and exclusive bars to last a lifetime, but there was something refreshing about this cozy, history-soaked pub. Everything here was grounded, genuine. Across from him, Lisa sat with her drink, looking more relaxed than he'd seen her all day. She'd shed the tension that usually accompanied their interactions, and he caught her eye, raising his glass with a smile. "How about another round?" he asked casually. Lisa glanced at her phone before shaking her head. "I should probably head home. I'm driving, after all." Brandon leaned forward, his voice low and playful. "What if I told you I'll arrange cabs for both of us? And tomorrow I'll make sure someone picks you up and gets your car sorted. That way, we can enjoy ourselves without worrying." Lisa gave a soft laugh, shaking her head. "You're persistent, aren't you?" "When it's something important, I always do my best to get my way," Brandon replied, holding her gaze. The air between them shifted subtly, the easy banter giving way to something more intense, more personal. Lisa hesitated, but then she put her keys in her bag with a resigned smile. "All right, one more drink, but you're in charge of making sure I'm not stranded tomorrow." "Deal," Brandon said, signaling to the bartender for another round. As their fresh drinks were placed on the table, Brandon noticed how the tension in his own body had dissipated. This wasn't just another business conversation, and he liked that. Lisa swirled her glass thoughtfully before looking at him, a teasing glint in her eyes. "So tell me something about yourself. Something real. No business, no football. Just you." Brandon chuckled, taking a sip of his drink. "Okay, here's one. I grew up working class. A lot of people assume I've always been this big businessman, but I know what it's like to hustle from the ground up. My family didn't have much, but I was good at spotting opportunities and grabbing onto them. That's how I got to where I am." Lisa's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Really? I didn't expect that." Brandon leaned back, smiling at her reaction. "I think people see the suit, the Bentley, and they assume it's always been that way. But I grew up in a small town, surrounded by normal people like the ones here. That's probably why I feel more at home in a place like this than you'd think." Lisa's smile widened and she leaned in a little closer. "That explains why you didn't seem out of place today." Brandon shrugged. "I get it. Growing up, I saw how hard people worked just to keep the lights on. I've been there. It's not that different from what I saw today. The only real difference is that I figured out how to capitalize on the few chances I had." Lisa looked at him, her expression softening. "It's funny, I wouldn't have guessed that about you." "Most people don't," Brandon admitted, meeting her gaze steadily. "But we all come from somewhere, right?" She nodded slowly, taking that in before speaking again. "All right, my turn. I collect vintage records. When things get stressful, I like to dig through old shops and see what hidden gems I can find." "Vintage records?" Brandon repeated, intrigued. "That's a hobby I didn't expect. What got you into that?" Lisa smiled, her eyes lighting up with excitement. I guess it started when I found my dad's old collection in the attic. There's something about the crackle of a vinyl that just, I don't know, it grounds me. Brandon raised his glass in appreciation. I'd love to see that collection sometime. You might have to play a few tracks for me. Maybe, Lisa said, smiling coyly. If you're lucky. Their conversation flowed smoothly, and as the hours ticked by, they shared stories that neither had anticipated telling. Brandon opened up about his childhood, his rise in business, and the difficult decisions that had come with success. Lisa, in turn, talked about her passion for the community and how her family had instilled a deep love of music and people in her from an early age. As the conversation deepened, the pub seemed to melt away, leaving Lisa and Brandon in their own private world. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, a magnetic pull neither could ignore. Lisa's heart skipped a beat every time Brandon leaned in slightly, his deep voice resonating as he opened up about his past. She hadn't expected to feel this way, but the more he shared, the more she noticed every detail about him. His broad shoulders stretched the fabric of his shirt in a way that hinted at strength, and the way his eyes, dark and focused, stayed locked on hers sent a shiver down her spine. Each time he gestured with his hands, she couldn't help but imagine what it would feel like to be touched by them. The drinks had made her bolder, her inhibitions slipping away, and now, with each passing minute, her thoughts strayed further from their conversation and more toward the space between them, small, but charged with heat. Brandon felt the shift too, the easygoing banter giving way to something more intense. As Lisa spoke about her love for vintage records, her voice soft and melodic, he found himself captivated not just by her words, but by everything about her. Her lips, plump and inviting, curved into a smile that had him hooked, and the soft flush in her cheeks gave her an irresistible glow. The way her dress clung to her curves drew his eyes, and every now and then he caught the faint scent of her perfume, a sweet, intoxicating mix that only heightened his awareness of her presence. His gaze traveled over her, lingering on the way her hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, framing her face perfectly. The drinks they'd shared had certainly loosened him up, and now every brush of her leg against his under the table, every time her fingers lightly grazed his as they reached for their glasses, sent a jolt of electricity through him. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with the possibility of what might come next, and Brandon found himself leaning in just a little closer, his pulse quickening as the space between them dwindled. The more they talked, the more the pub around them seemed to fade into the background. It wasn't until the bell rang for last orders that they both blinked, realizing just how late it had gotten. Brandon raised an eyebrow, glancing toward the bar. Did they just ring a bell? Is that like a signal for something? Lisa laughed softly. Yeah, it's for last orders. It's the pub's way of saying they're about to close, so it's your last chance to get a drink. Lisa glanced at her watch and laughed. I guess we've closed the place down. Brandon grinned, feeling a warm buzz from both the drinks and their shared stories. Guess that's our cue. They stood up and made their way out of the pub, the cool night air wrapping around them as they stepped onto the street. The cab Brandon had arranged was already waiting, and they slid into the back seat, the intimate quiet of the night settling around them. In the dim glow of the cab, the world outside seemed to blur, leaving only the two of them in a quiet, intimate space. The noise of the city faded into the background, and the steady hum of the engine was a soft reminder of the movement around them. As they sat there, the conversation between them slowed naturally, replaced by a comfortable silence that carried a new kind of tension. When their hands brushed against each other, the light touch seemed to send a subtle spark through the air. Lisa felt her heart skip a beat, her skin warm where Brandon's fingers had briefly made contact. Though she leaned back, her attention was fully on him, aware of the charged atmosphere between them. Brandon shifted a little closer, the space between them growing smaller as his gaze found hers. In the soft light, his eyes held hers for a moment longer than usual, and she could sense something unspoken passing between them. The air felt heavier, filled with an anticipation that neither could deny. Lisa's breath quickened slightly as the cab grew quiet, the distant sounds of the city muted, The soft rhythm of Brandon's breathing was all she could hear, and it made her more aware of the warmth between them, a connection that seemed to build with every second. Brandon's hand lingered near hers again, their fingers brushing once more, but this time the touch lingered. Lisa's heart raced as the moment stretched out. The space between them seemed to shrink, drawing them closer. Slowly, almost instinctively, she leaned in, her eyes glancing briefly at his lips, the pull between them undeniable. The air around them felt charged, their faces now inches apart, as if everything had been leading up to this point. But just as Brandon leaned in further, her phone buzzed loudly, snapping both of them out of the moment. Lisa blinked in surprise, her cheeks flushing as she fumbled for her phone. "Sorry," she muttered, the intensity of the moment fading as she glanced down at the screen, the tension between them dissipating as quickly as it had built. Her cheeks flushed as she glanced at the screen. Brandon sighed softly, leaning back with a rueful smile. "Everything okay?" Lisa groaned in frustration, shaking her head. "One of the prize winners is complaining that the t-shirt they got is too small." Brandon chuckled, his tension easing as the moment passed. "Guess we'll have to fix that tomorrow." Lisa shot him an exasperated smile, but there was still a trace of warmth in her eyes. "Yeah, we'll handle it." As the cab continued its ride, they settled back into a comfortable silence. Despite the interruption, the night had revealed a lot more than either of them had expected. The attraction was undeniable, but more than that, there was an understanding, a shared connection that neither had anticipated. And as the city passed by outside the window, both Brandon and Lisa knew that this night had marked the beginning of something neither of them could ignore.
We just wanted to pop in to say that we are so happy that you are still listening to this point. If you are enjoying this romance audiobook, it would really help us out if you can hit the like button. We hope you continue to enjoy this story and would really appreciate it if you can just hit that like button. Thank you. Now back to the story.
Chapter 7. Lisa sat at her desk, fingers absently tapping on the keyboard, but her mind wasn't on the community newsletter she was supposed to be writing. Instead, her thoughts kept drifting back to the previous night at the Cleves Arms, the unexpected ease of her conversation with Brandon, and that fleeting moment where their connection felt undeniably real. She shook her head, trying to push the memory aside while saying to herself, "You're reading too much into it, Lisa. It was just a few drinks. That's all." The door to the office swung open and Clara breezed in with her usual energy. "How's it going with the newsletter?" she asked as she dropped into the chair opposite Lisa. "Oh, it's coming along," Lisa replied, keeping her tone casual as she glanced at her screen, though it was painfully blank. Clara tilted her head, a smile playing on her lips. "So Brandon joined you for the outreach event yesterday. How did that go?" Lisa tensed ever so slightly, quickly refocusing on the screen as if it held some vital piece of information. "It went fine. You know, just the usual, showing him around, meeting supporters." Clara folded her arms, her eyes narrowing in on Lisa like she could sense something more was going on. "Uh-huh. So just another regular day with the new club owner in tow? Nothing else worth mentioning?" Lisa shrugged, her heart thumping faster in her chest. "Pretty much. Nothing out of the ordinary." Clara raised an eyebrow, not buying it. "Come on, Lisa. You've been off since you walked in this morning. You spent all day with Brandon and now you're acting. I don't know, distracted." Lisa forced a laugh, trying to sound nonchalant. "It was work, Clara. I don't know what else you think happened." Clara leaned forward, her gaze sharpening with curiosity. "Uh-huh. And you're sure that's all it was? Because you seem a little too vague for something that was just work." Lisa bit the inside of her cheek, trying to find a way to dodge the question. She could feel Clara's eyes on her, waiting. The truth was, ever since last night, she hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something had shifted between her and Brandon. But the last thing she wanted was to make a big deal out of it. "Honestly, Clara, it was fine. We had a couple of drinks with the supporters afterward, but that's it." Clara's eyebrows shot up, and she leaned in closer. "Drinks, huh? And how did that go?" Lisa looked away, pretending to adjust something on her desk. "It was fine. We talked, nothing more." But Clara wasn't letting go. "Nothing more? Lisa, you're acting weird, and I'm starting to think something did happen. You're not yourself today." Lisa sighed, feeling the pressure to give in. Okay. There was a moment, but it was nothing. Clara's eyes lit up, and she leaned in, eager. A moment? Oh, you've got to give me more than that. Lisa hesitated, still trying to play it down. We almost kissed, but we didn't. I pulled away. Clara's grin widened. Almost kissed? Wow, I didn't see that coming. So, why didn't you just go for it? Lisa shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I don't know. We'd had a couple of drinks, and I thought maybe he was just dropping his inhibitions, you know? I didn't want to read too much into it. Clara studied her for a moment before shaking her head. You're trying to downplay this, aren't you? It's okay to admit there's something between you two. Lisa groaned. It's not that I'm downplaying it. It's just complicated. I don't want to get carried away over one night, especially when I don't even know what he's thinking. Clara leaned back, a playful smile on her face. Okay, but you're clearly attracted to him. Lisa didn't respond right away, but she knew Clara was right. As much as she tried to downplay it, there was an undeniable spark with Brandon. But how could she trust that it was real, or that it was more than just the drinks loosening him up? I don't know, Lisa finally admitted, her voice quieter. There's something there, sure, but I don't want to make too much of it. What if it was just the drinks talking? Clara gave her a knowing look. Or what if it wasn't? Lisa sighed again, running a hand through her hair. Maybe, but I need to be cautious, Clara. It's not like I'm about to jump headfirst into anything. Clara chuckled. I'm not saying you should, but don't overthink it either. Sometimes a spark is just a spark. Why not let it be what it is? Lisa gave her a half smile, still unsure. I'll think about it. Brandon adjusted his cufflinks, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The suit was sharp, as always, but something felt off. His mind wasn't where it should be. Today was important. There were revenue meetings, sponsorship deals to finalize, and long-term strategies to iron out for Eastvale United. He had just taken over the club, and now, more than ever, focus was crucial. But his thoughts kept drifting. Back to yesterday. Back to Lisa. Brandon let out a slow breath, pulling on his jacket. The day he'd spent with her was unlike anything he had expected. He'd gone in thinking it would be a routine day of meetings, introductions, and shaking hands with locals. But what he hadn't anticipated was the way Lisa had unsettled him, in the best and worst ways. He was used to spotting opportunities, businesses to acquire, deals to close, people to leverage, and acting decisively. But this wasn't like that. This wasn't about seizing an opportunity and moving on. It felt complicated. And that was a problem. A big one. Brandon headed downstairs, his thoughts heavy as he grabbed his phone and wallet. Normally, this part of his routine was straightforward. Get ready, get in the car, mentally prep for the day's meetings. But today, all he could think about was Lisa's smile, the way she connected with the people in Eastvale. The spark between them, that moment where he had almost crossed the line, almost let himself give in to her. But he hadn't, because he knew better. Tom, his driver, opened the car door for him, and Brandon slid into the back seat, giving a quick nod. Morning, Tom, he said, but his mind was already elsewhere as the car pulled away from his house. The meeting with Jake was scheduled for the afternoon. They were going to go over the club's financials, new revenue streams, sponsorship opportunities, important things, things that should have been occupying his mind. But instead, he was distracted. He could still feel the echo of that almost kiss with Lisa, like it was some unresolved business gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. It was ridiculous. He had a club to run, a multi-million-pound business to grow, and here he was, thinking about a woman who could complicate everything. Brandon's jaw tightened as the car wove through the city streets. He prided himself on staying focused, on compartmentalizing when necessary. That's how he'd gotten this far. With his ex, it had been easy. His relationship with her had been practical. He could turn his emotions on and off like a switch when the time called for it, because he knew what that relationship was, a convenience. They were good for each other's public image, but there had never been depth. With Lisa, it wasn't like that. He couldn't just shut off his feelings. It frustrated him. Yesterday, sitting in that pub with her, he had felt something stir that he wasn't ready for. Something real. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he could control it. A notification flashed across his phone screen. Meeting with Jake, 2 p.m. He should be thinking about that meeting. But no matter how hard he tried to focus on the numbers, the sponsorships, the growth potential, his mind kept wandering back to Lisa. His grip on the armrest tightened as a realization hit him. This was more than just a fleeting distraction. If he wasn't careful, it could turn into something that interfered with the very reason he had come to Eastvale in the first place. Running a football club, especially one with as much potential as this, required absolute focus. There was too much at stake, too many deals to close, too much money to be made. Getting emotionally involved right now was the worst possible thing he could do. And yet, Lisa wasn't like his ex. With her, things felt genuine, real. That was what unnerved him the most. He couldn't just flip the switch off like he had in the past. She was already under his skin, and trying to pretend otherwise was starting to feel like a losing battle. The car turned a corner, the familiar gates of Eastvale United looming ahead, but even as the stadium came into view, Brandon found it difficult to switch gears. Normally, the sight of the stadium, the business opportunity it represented, would be enough to snap him back into focus. But today, all he could think about was Lisa. Her laughter, her fire, the way she looked at him like she could see past the business suit and the sharp talk. He had to pull it together. This was not the time to get distracted. He was here to build something big. But no matter how hard he tried to focus on what was coming next, the thought of Lisa lingered at the back of his mind, refusing to be pushed aside. His mind kept drifting back to that night in the cab, to the moment when they were so close to a kiss. He could still feel the warmth of her next to him, the tension between them almost unbearable, before her phone interrupted. He kicked himself for letting it slip away, for not taking the moment while it was there. But then he reminded himself it was probably for the best. Kissing Lisa would have complicated everything, bringing emotions into something that needed to stay professional. He was here to build a new business, and getting involved with her, no matter how tempting, could blur that focus. He needed to stay sharp, not distracted by feelings that might make things messy. Even so, the thought of her lingered, nagging at him like an unfinished conversation he couldn't quite leave behind. Chapter 8. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over Eastvale United Stadium as the final touches were being made for the charity gala. Lisa stood at the center of it all, clipboard in hand, directing volunteers with an air of calm. But internally, her mind buzzed with thoughts of Brandon. After the previous evening, her feelings for him had become harder to ignore. The gala, which was supposed to be a straightforward event, felt heavy with unspoken tension between them. Brandon had been distant since their almost kiss. She could sense his focus was on the event, but that didn't stop the flickers of attraction she felt whenever he was near. She couldn't let that distract her tonight. The gala wasn't just an opportunity to showcase the community programs she had poured her heart into. It was also a chance for the club to solidify its connection with the people. But Brandon saw it differently, and that was where the tension between them sat. "Lisa, are we ready to start?" one of the volunteers asked, breaking her out of her thoughts. She glanced up to see Brandon across the room, deep in conversation with Jake. She sighed, adjusting the microphone pinned to her dress. "As ready as we'll ever be," she muttered, stealing one last glance at Brandon before heading backstage to ensure the program was ready to go live. Brandon scanned the room as guests began to file in, local business owners, sponsors, and influential community members. On the surface, everything was perfect, but his mind wasn't on the deals he needed to close tonight. It was on Lisa. The evening before had stirred something in him, something he couldn't ignore. She'd gotten under his skin, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. His thoughts briefly returned to the meeting he'd had earlier that day with Jake. They had spent hours discussing new revenue opportunities, sponsorship deals, partnerships with corporate backers, ways to boost profits at the club. Jake had been pushing hard, as usual, for strategies that would increase the club's bottom line. For Brandon, it had been a day filled with numbers and business decisions. But even in the midst of those talks, Lisa had lingered in the back of his mind, distracting him. "Brandon, are you with me?" Jake's voice cut through his thoughts, bringing him back to the present. Brandon blinked, realizing Jake was still talking about potential partnerships for the evening. Yeah, sorry, Brandon muttered, refocusing. You were saying? I was saying this gala is exactly what we need. If we lock in these sponsors tonight, we'll be in a strong position for next season, Jake reiterated. Brandon nodded absently. Right. Yeah, we need to push for that. He wasn't completely tuned out. He knew how important these sponsorships were for the club's future. But something about Lisa's presence drew him away from the business side of things. She moved with such purpose, her dedication to the community clear in every interaction. And tonight, that was something he couldn't just ignore. As he scanned the crowd again, his gaze settled on one of the potential sponsors, Darren Hughes, who ran the prominent online casino Ruby Roll. Jake had been particularly keen on securing Hughes' support for the club, citing the financial benefits of his sponsorship. But Brandon couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling in his gut. He'd heard the rumors. Hughes was known to make offhand homophobic remarks, and worse, the club had done a lot of work in the past to combat gambling issues in the community. Associating with him seemed wrong. But Jake had insisted they needed the money, and Brandon hadn't pushed back. Yet. Still, Brandon filed that thought away for later. Tonight wasn't the time to cause friction. He'd deal with Hughes when the time came. The night moved on, and the event was running smoothly. Lisa finally allowed herself to relax, just a little. She caught sight of Brandon again, speaking with a small group of potential sponsors, including Darren Hughes. She couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him, but seeing him so effortlessly work the room, especially with someone like Hughes, made her stomach tighten. Could she really trust him when his focus seemed to be on profits, no matter the cost? Her stomach churned as she thought about the rumors surrounding Hughes, the gambling problems, the homophobic comments. The idea of Brandon aligning with someone like that unsettled her. The club had spent years building trust in the community through outreach programs, many of them focused on helping those affected by gambling addiction. How could Brandon even consider partnering with someone who ran an online casino? She had to push those thoughts aside for now, but they lingered in the back of her mind like a bad taste. She turned away, making her way toward the buffet, hoping to find a distraction. But before she could grab a plate, she heard his voice behind her. "You've done an amazing job with this event," Brandon said, stepping up beside her. Lisa turned, startled by his sudden appearance. She hadn't expected him to pull away from the sponsors so quickly. "Thanks," she replied, her voice steady, though her pulse quickened. "It's important for the community." "I can see that," Brandon said, his tone softer now, more sincere. "I've been talking to a lot of people tonight, and it's clear how much this club means to them. I didn't fully get it before." Lisa tilted her head, studying him. "Really?" Brandon nodded. "Yeah. I mean, I still think we need to focus on making the club more profitable, but I'm starting to see how much the community side matters too." Lisa wasn't sure what to make of his words. It was a step in the right direction, but there was still so much she didn't know about his true intentions. "The community is everything to this club," she said quietly, turning back to the buffet. "Without it, there's no heart." Brandon reached for a plate, his shoulder brushing against hers as he moved closer. "I'm starting to understand that." The warmth of his presence caught Lisa off guard, and she struggled to keep her thoughts clear. This wasn't just about business anymore. Something had shifted between them. She could feel it in the air. She wanted to believe that he could understand what Eastvale meant to her, but the walls she'd built to protect herself were hard to let go of. As the evening wore on, Lisa found herself outside, taking a moment to breathe. The fresh air was a welcome escape from the crowded room and the intensity that Brandon's presence always seemed to bring. She didn't hear him approach until he spoke. Escaping the madness? She turned, finding him standing just a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, looking as out of place as she felt. "For a minute," Lisa admitted. "It's been a long night." Brandon nodded, stepping closer. "I get that, but I think you pulled it off. The sponsors are impressed, and the community seems happy." Lisa offered a small smile. "That's the goal." They stood in silence for a moment, the night air cool against their skin. Brandon cleared his throat, his voice quiet when he finally spoke. "Lisa, about last night?" She cut him off, shaking her head. It was nothing. We both had a few drinks, and it didn't mean anything. Brandon's expression softened, his gaze locking onto hers. You don't really believe that, do you? Lisa looked away, biting her lip. She didn't know what to believe. The spark between them was undeniable, but so were the complications. I don't know, she admitted softly. I don't know what to think. Brandon stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. About you. Her heart pounded in her chest, but before she could respond, the sharp sound of glass shattering echoed from inside the ballroom. Both of them jolted, turning their heads toward the noise. Brandon sighed, breaking the tension with a soft chuckle. Looks like someone's had too much to drink. Lisa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, grateful for the distraction, but also frustrated by how quickly the moment had slipped away. She smiled faintly. I should get back inside, she said, her voice a little unsteady. Brandon nodded, his expression unreadable as he watched her walk away. The moment had passed, but the tension between them hadn't. It would come back. It always did. Chapter 9. The gala had gone off without a hitch, at least from an outsider's perspective. But as the last of the guests left and the conference room within the stadium slowly emptied, Brandon could sense the tension that still hung in the air between him and Lisa. He knew this was the moment he'd been dreading. Brandon and Jake had just spent the last 45 minutes seated at one of the event tables, engaged in an unexpected but promising meeting with Darren Hughes from Ruby Roll. What had started as casual small talk quickly turned into a spontaneous business discussion, and it was shaping up to be a potentially lucrative opportunity. Darren, relaxed yet clearly driven, explained how he had been eager to secure a sponsorship deal with Eastvale United at the start of last season. Unfortunately, the deal had fallen through back then due to some complications, but his enthusiasm hadn't faded. He was still very much interested in aligning Ruby Roll with the club, and his excitement for the potential partnership filled the conversation. As Darren continued laying out the possible terms, Brandon couldn't help but notice Lisa seated a few tables away, her eyes frequently glancing over with a disapproving look. Every time her gaze met theirs, the disapproval in her expression was unmistakable. Her furrowed brow and tightened lips revealed she wasn't pleased with the direction of the conversation. It was clear that, whatever Darren was proposing, Lisa wasn't on board with it. Her silent judgment lingered, casting a shadow over what should have been an easy business decision. Brandon shifted in his seat, a sense of unease creeping in as Darren spoke excitedly about branding opportunities and expanding Ruby Roll's presence. The more Lisa's disapproving glances burned into him, the more he questioned whether this seemingly lucrative deal was as straightforward as Darren made it sound. The deal with Ruby Roll, Darren Hughes' company, had been lurking beneath the surface for days, and now, as they worked side by side cleaning up, Lisa was bound to bring it up. Lisa walked over, watching as Brandon stacked another chair onto the pile. She raised an eyebrow, her tone sharp yet teasing. Not exactly what I pictured a billionaire doing, stacking chairs. Brandon smirked, wiping his hands off on his trousers. I'm not scared of getting my hands dirty. Sometimes you have to do the grunt work. Lisa didn't laugh. Instead, her expression shifted, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Speaking of dirty work, we need to talk about Ruby Roll. There it was. The conversation he had known was coming. Brandon lowered his gaze for a moment before meeting her eyes again. Lisa, I know you've got concerns, but I'm trying to do what's best for the club. This deal? It's a mistake, she cut in, her frustration clear. Ruby Roll? Darren Hughes? Do you even know the kind of damage they've done to people in communities like Eastvale? It's not about business, Brandon. It's about the families. Real families who've been torn apart because of gambling addictions. We've worked so hard to help them, and you want to take money from the very people who caused the harm? Brandon exhaled, his frustration simmering. I'm not ignoring that, Lisa, but we're talking about tens of millions of pounds here. That kind of money could secure the future of the club, keep the youth programs, the outreach, everything going. We can't survive without it. Lisa's eyes flared and she stepped closer, her voice tightening. You think you can take that money and everything will be fine? The community will see right through it. All the work we've done to support families dealing with gambling addiction, it will all look like a front. Tokenistic. People will think we're hypocrites, and they won't trust the club again. Brandon clenched his jaw. He knew what Ruby Roll stood for. Online casinos, betting shops, everything that preyed on addiction. Darren Hughes had built his fortune off the backs of people who couldn't stop themselves, but Brandon had always been able to separate the man from the deal. It had been business. Just business. Until now. I'm trying to keep the club alive, Lisa. We can't run on goodwill alone, he said, his voice softening. Without serious funding, we're not gonna last. Lisa's frustration deepened, and she shook her head, pacing a few steps away before turning back to him. It's more than that, Brandon. Darren Hughes isn't just a businessman with a bad rep. He's made hateful remarks about ethnic communities, about LGBTQ+ people. And you want to put this club, that's all about inclusivity. Next to that, Brandon fell silent for a moment. He had known about Hughes's past comments, the way they'd flared up online. His unapologetic remarks about immigrants, about the gay community, were public record. But to Brandon, it had always been easy to overlook when the numbers were this big. He'd never stopped to think about how it might actually affect someone like Lisa, who was deeply rooted in the community, who cared about more than just numbers. I know who Darren Hughes is, Brandon said quietly, and I know what Ruby Roll represents. But I'm trying to find a way through this, Lisa. The club needs a future. She stared at him, her expression hardening. If you go through with this, there won't be a future worth saving. People here won't forgive you for aligning with someone like Hughes. You'll destroy the trust we've spent years building. Brandon wanted to argue, to tell her that she wasn't seeing the bigger picture, that the club would collapse without major sponsorships like this one. But as he stood there, watching the disappointment in her eyes, he realized that she wasn't just talking about the deal. She was talking about him, about what he represented now. He took a step toward her, lowering his voice. Lisa? But she cut him off again, shaking her head, already turning away. You still don't get it, Brandon, she said, her voice tight with frustration. This isn't just about money. It's about values, about what this club stands for. You're supposed to be leading us, not selling us out to the highest bidder. The words hit harder than he expected, the space between them growing as she walked to the far end of the room. He had felt them getting closer these past few weeks, the shared moments, the understanding that had been slowly building. But now, all of that seemed to be unraveling. He had thought he could protect the club and still keep her trust. But now it felt like he was losing both. Lisa paused near the door, her shoulders stiff. Without turning around, she spoke again, her voice distant. It's fine, Brandon. We'll talk about it tomorrow. She glanced back at him briefly, her tone professional and cold. Don't forget we have the youth outreach prep meeting tomorrow afternoon. Brandon stood frozen, watching as she left the room. The conference room felt emptier now, the silence heavy. He had come into this thinking he could make a deal and move on, the same way he had done countless times before. But now, as Lisa walked away, the weight of the decision settled on him in a way he hadn't anticipated. For the first time in a long time, Brandon didn't know how to fix this. And for the first time, it wasn't just the business at stake. It was something deeper, something he hadn't even realized he cared about until now. The last few days had been a whirlwind of meetings and community projects, but the growing tension between Lisa and Brandon weighed on every moment they spent together. He had shown up to every event, met every deadline, and followed her lead with a determination that surprised her. But there was a distance, a hesitation, as if something unspoken lingered between them. Lisa tried to push the thoughts aside as they walked into the local community outreach center. She loved this place. It was a safe haven for kids who had nowhere else to go. But today, her usual excitement was tempered by the presence of Brandon. She wasn't sure what to make of him anymore. He was hard to read. 1 minute, the cold businessman. The next, something softer, something almost real. This is the main hall, Lisa explained, gesturing around as they entered. The familiar sound of children laughing and playing filled the air, warming her heart as it always did. We run most of the programs here. After-school tutoring, sports activities, art classes. These kids are incredible. Brandon nodded, his expression distant as he scanned the room. Lisa braced herself for one of his comments about the state of the place, the worn furniture, the outdated equipment, but he said nothing. Instead, he simply watched as a group of children rushed past them, excitedly showing off their latest drawings. I know it's not much, Lisa added, glancing at him, but we make it work. The club's support has been essential. Brandon didn't respond right away, and when Lisa looked over at him again, she saw something she didn't expect. He wasn't just observing, he was engaged. He was watching the kids with an intensity that caught her off guard. A group of them ran up, tugging at her arm, eager to show off their drawings. Lisa knelt down, smiling as they described their work. When she glanced back at Brandon, she saw him crouched next to a young boy, quietly asking about his drawing of a football stadium. The boy, shy and hesitant at first, slowly opened up as Brandon complimented his work. You've got a real talent, Brandon said softly, his voice genuine. Keep practicing, and one day you might be designing real stadiums. Lisa watched the scene unfold, her heart softening in spite of herself. She hadn't expected this from Brandon. He had always seemed so driven by numbers and deals, but here he seemed different. This wasn't the man who almost sold out the club to Ruby Roll, the man who made cold, calculated decisions. This was someone she hadn't seen before. For a moment, the frustration she'd been holding on to faded. But as quickly as it came, she forced it back. She couldn't forget who Brandon was, or rather, who he still might be. Sure, he was kind to the kids today, but that didn't erase the fact that he'd nearly aligned the club with a company like Ruby Roll. And worse, he hadn't even told her if he'd backed out of the deal. The truth was, Brandon had already decided to cancel the deal with Ruby Roll. He knew it was wrong for the club, for the community, and for Lisa. But he hadn't told her yet. He wasn't ready. Not when he didn't have a backup plan. It wasn't enough to just cancel the deal. He needed something to replace it. And right now, he had nothing. Telling Lisa that he'd walked away without a solid plan felt like admitting defeat, and he wasn't willing to do that yet. As the kids moved on to show their drawings to others, Lisa stood, brushing her hands on her jeans. The kids here, they depend on places like this. It's more than just football to them, you know? Brandon rose to his feet, nodding thoughtfully. I see that now. They need more than just a club. They need stability. Lisa looked at him, surprised by his words. She wanted to believe that he meant them, that he wasn't just saying what he thought she wanted to hear, but there was still something in his eyes that made her hesitate. You're right, she said, her voice cautious, which is why it's so important that we don't make deals that could harm them. Brandon's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Lisa thought he was going to say something about Ruby Roll. Part of her wanted him to. She wanted to hear that he had made the right decision, that he'd backed out of the deal. But he remained silent, and the tension between them returned. They spent the rest of the afternoon moving through the center, meeting more of the kids and staff. Brandon continued to surprise her. He was kind, engaged, even made a few of the children laugh with his stories. It wasn't the Brandon she had known a week ago, but despite her growing admiration, Lisa remained cautious. As they finished up and walked back toward the car park, Lisa couldn't help but feel the weight of the unspoken words between them. She was torn. On one hand, she was starting to see a side of Brandon she hadn't expected, a side that cared about the community and the people it served. But on the other hand, she still didn't know where he stood on Ruby Roll. And until she knew that, she couldn't let herself trust him completely. You've been great with the kids today, Lisa said as they reached her car. I didn't expect that from you. Brandon smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. They're good kids. They deserve better. Lisa studied him, trying to gauge if he meant it. She wanted to believe that he did, but something still felt off. So where do we stand, Brandon? With everything? Brandon hesitated, his gaze flickering away from hers for a moment. He wanted to tell her the truth, that he'd canceled the deal with Ruby Roll because he knew it wasn't right. But without a solid backup plan, what would that even mean? He couldn't face her with empty hands, not after everything. Lisa, he began, but then he stopped, shaking his head. I'm working on it. Lisa frowned, sensing his reluctance. Working on what? He didn't answer directly, and instead he shifted the focus. I don't want to make a decision that will hurt the community, Lisa. I'm trying to do what's right. She searched his face, looking for the truth, but all she saw was a man who was keeping something from her. And that was all she needed to know. Until he was ready to be honest, she couldn't let herself get too close. I hope you do, she said quietly, because the community is counting on you. Brandon nodded, his expression tight. I won't let them down. But as he turned and walked toward his car, Lisa wasn't sure if she believed him. She couldn't afford to get too close to someone who might still make the wrong choice. The stakes were too high, both for the community and for her heart.
Thank you for staying with us and listening to this romance audiobook. We have a quick favor to ask. Can you think of someone who would also enjoy this romance audiobook? Take a moment to think of that one special person. Got them in mind? Great! Now just hit the share button beneath this video and send it their way. They'll appreciate it, and you'll be helping us out too. By sharing this video, it allows us to reach more people with our stories, and for the person you send this to, it's a thoughtful way to show you're thinking of them. Now, let's get back to the story.
Chapter 10. Brandon sat at the head of the long, polished conference table, tapping a pen against the smooth surface as Jake reviewed the latest financial projections on the screen. Despite the figures, his mind kept wandering back to Lisa and the argument they'd had the previous night. He hated the growing tension between them, but more than that, he hated how it was affecting his judgment. Lisa had a way of making him question everything. Brandon, are you even listening? Jake's voice snapped him back to the present. Brandon cleared his throat and sat up straighter. Yeah, sorry, go on. Jake rolled his eyes. As I was saying, Ruby Roll is keen to push forward with the sponsorship deal. Darren Hughes wants to meet next week to finalize everything. Brandon felt a weight settle in his chest. Ruby Roll, Hughes' company, notorious for gambling addictions and tearing families apart, not to mention Hughes's public remarks against ethnic and LGBTQ+ communities. It wasn't just a bad deal. It was a disaster waiting to happen. The club couldn't afford that kind of reputation. Brandon realized this wasn't just a bad deal for the club. It was a bad deal for him. Lisa had opened his eyes, making him more aware of the values he truly stood for. And the more he listened to Darren Hughes, the clearer it became that Ruby Roll's principles didn't align with his own. The partnership might have been lucrative, but it clashed with everything he wanted for the club and himself. Still, he had to admit the money was tempting. $30 million. It could fund community outreach programs, youth training, and even improvements to the facilities. But every time he thought about signing the papers, Lisa's voice echoed in his head. She was right. Accepting Hughes' money would destroy the trust they'd built with the community. Jake continued, oblivious to the storm brewing in Brandon's mind. I know you've had some concerns, but I think you're overthinking it. The community will move on. They always do when the money starts flowing. We're talking about tens of millions of pounds here, Brandon. The club needs this. Brandon rubbed his temples, fighting off the tension building in his skull. I don't know, Jake. I'm not sure we should go through with it. Jake raised an eyebrow. What are you talking about? This deal is huge. Darren Hughes is offering us more than anyone else would. I know, Brandon replied, his voice heavy, but the values of Ruby Roll don't align with what this club stands for. Hughes is bad news, and you know it. Jake folded his arms, leaning back in his chair. And since when do we run this club based on values? It's a business, Brandon. We need the cash. Brandon looked at the screen again, the flashing numbers reminding him just how much was at stake. The club was on the brink of greatness. But without more money, all the work they'd done could come crashing down. I just keep thinking about what the fans will think if I sign this deal, Brandon muttered, the words slipping out before he could stop himself. Jake gave him a sideways glance. The fans? Or is this more about how much time you've been spending with Lisa on all that community outreach stuff? She's getting to you, isn't she? Brandon tensed, but before he could respond, Jake continued. You've never let emotions cloud your judgment before. Don't start now. Brandon clenched his fists under the table. Jake didn't get it. It wasn't just about the deal or even about Lisa. It was about what was right for the club and the community it represented. The more he tried to convince himself it wasn't about her, the more he realized it was. His feelings for Lisa had complicated everything, but it wasn't just because of her. This deal was a bad one, and he knew it, even if it made financial sense. "I don't want to go ahead with the Ruby Roll deal," Brandon said, his voice firm. Jake stared at him, his face a mix of shock and frustration. "What? You can't be serious." Brandon stood up, pacing the length of the room. "Find another solution. There has to be another way to get the funding we need." "There's nothing else, Brandon. Not at this level, not in time for next season. You're risking everything by walking away from this." Brandon stopped, turning to face Jake. "I'd rather risk everything than sell out the club to someone like Darren Hughes." Jake sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I might be able to find something else, but nothing close to what Ruby Roll is offering. You're gambling the future of this club." Brandon met his eyes, his decision made. "Then so be it. Find another option." Chapter 11. Brandon paced the length of his office, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. The headlines were everywhere. Eastvale United sells out to gambling giant. Ruby Roll to sponsor Eastvale United. Community in uproar. The story had somehow leaked to the media, and now it looked like the club was moving ahead with the Ruby Roll deal, despite the fact that Brandon had already pulled the plug days ago. He slammed his fist against his desk in frustration. The backlash was immediate, with fans taking to social media, sports channels running with the story, and even community leaders voicing their disappointment. Everything was spiraling out of control. But what really ate at him was how this would affect his relationship with Lisa. She already doubted him, and now it looked like he had gone behind her back and agreed to the very deal she'd been fighting against. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Brandon called, not bothering to mask his irritation. Jake entered, his face set in a grim line. He closed the door behind him and crossed the room, tossing a few printouts of the headlines onto the desk. "I saw," Jake said, leaning against the desk. "It's bad." Brandon shook his head, still seething. "How the hell did this get out? I called off the deal days ago, and now it's like we're still going ahead with it." Jake frowned. "I don't know how it leaked, but the damage is done. The fans are furious, and it's all over the media." Brandon exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I can deal with the media, but the fans, they think I'm selling out the club. And Lisa." He cut himself off, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Lisa? Is that what this is about?" Brandon shot him a glare. "It's not just about her, Jake. It's about trust. The fans, the community, they're the heart of this club. And now, it looks like I've betrayed them. I canceled the damn deal, and yet this is the narrative." Jake gave a nod, his expression thoughtful. "Look, I get it. This is a mess. But we need to focus on moving forward. Ruby Roll is dead, but that doesn't mean we're out of options. I've got something else in the works." Brandon looked up, his frustration momentarily giving way to curiosity. "Something else?" Jake nodded but hesitated. "It's very early days. I don't want to say too much yet because there's no guarantee it'll come through. But if it does, this deal could be even bigger than Ruby Roll, without all the baggage." Brandon felt a flicker of hope, but quickly buried it under the weight of everything that had gone wrong. "I don't care what it is, Jake. Just make sure it's clean. We can't afford to take another hit like this." Jake smirked, his usual confidence returning. "Don't worry, I've got this. You'll like what I'm working on." Brandon leaned back in his chair, his anger starting to ebb, but replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. "Do whatever you need to do to get this deal done. We need to turn this around, fast." Jake gave a curt nod, but before he left, he paused at the door. "You're letting this Lisa thing get in your head. It's affecting your judgment." Brandon's jaw tightened. "Lisa isn't the problem, Jake. This is about the club and doing what's right." Jake shrugged. "If you say so. But just remember, this is still a business. Don't lose sight of that." After Jake left, the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Brandon stared out the window, watching the clouds roll over the city skyline. He knew Jake was right about one thing. This was a business. And yet something had shifted in him. When he first bought the club, everything had been about profit margins and brand growth. But now, the more time he spent with Lisa and the community, the less certain he was that he wanted to follow that path. The Ruby Roll debacle had shown him just how deep his connection to the community had grown. He cared about what happened to Eastvale, about the people who looked up to the club for more than just football. And Lisa? She had become more than just someone he worked with. She challenged him, pushed him to see things differently, and now he found himself questioning if his traditional business approach was the right way forward. Brandon exhaled, rubbing his temples. He had built his entire career on making tough, sometimes ruthless decisions. But this time, things felt different. He wasn't sure if it was Lisa or the community, but something had changed in him. The club needed a new deal, and fast. But more than that, Brandon needed to figure out where he stood, whether he could be the man who balanced business with doing the right thing. Because if he couldn't, he wasn't sure what the future held. For him, for the club, or for whatever was happening between him and Lisa. Chapter 12. Brandon sat behind his desk, his fingers tapping restlessly against the wood as he stared at the headlines scattered across his laptop screen. The backlash about the Ruby Roll sponsorship deal had thrown the club into chaos, and the anger from the fans and the community was worse than he had anticipated. Yet it wasn't just the public backlash that bothered him. It was the thought of how Lisa would react once she heard about the leak. The knock on the door came as no surprise. Lisa entered, her expression tired but resolute. She crossed her arms as she sat down in front of him, clearly ready to have a difficult conversation. "We need to talk about what's going on," she said, her voice sharp with frustration. "This Ruby Roll deal, the community is furious, and we're losing trust. You have to see that, Brandon." Brandon leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "Lisa, I know, I get it, but listen to me. I'm not going ahead with the Ruby Roll deal." Lisa blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "You're not?" Brandon shook his head. "No, I called it off days ago. It wasn't right for the club, for the community, or for anyone. I couldn't do it." For a moment, Lisa was silent, processing his words. "So, you canceled the deal? And you didn't think it was important to tell me?" "I wanted to," Brandon said, his voice softer now. "But I didn't have anything else lined up. I couldn't come to you and tell you I canceled the deal without having a backup plan in place. You deserve better than that." Lisa stared at him, the tension between them palpable. "I'm not asking for perfect answers, Brandon, but you should have told me." "I know," he admitted, his eyes sincere, "but it's not just about the deal. It's about everything that's been happening between us." Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She had been trying to ignore the growing connection between them, burying it under her frustration and the mounting pressure from the community. But now, hearing Brandon acknowledge it so plainly, left her exposed. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Brandon stood up, walking around his desk until he was standing directly in front of her. His presence filled the room, making the space between them feel impossibly small. "I'm saying that I can't pretend anymore. You matter, Lisa. You've made me see things differently. Made me question decisions I would have never thought twice about before." Lisa felt her heart pound in her chest. "Brandon, this is complicated. The club, the community, all of it. This isn't something we can just—" "I know," Brandon interrupted gently, "but that doesn't change how I feel about you." Lisa bit her lip, her mind racing. She had spent weeks, long, exhausting weeks, trying to keep her feelings for him at bay, convincing herself that they were just colleagues. But now, sitting in front of him, hearing him speak so openly, she couldn't deny it any longer. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Because I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it," Brandon admitted, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've spent so much time trying to protect the club, the business side of things, but with you, it's different. You've shown me that this club is more than just a business. It's people's lives, and I don't want to lose you." Lisa's heart swelled, but she also felt a familiar sense of caution rising inside her. "Brandon, I don't want to be another decision you regret." "You're not," he said firmly, stepping closer until he was standing right in front of her. "I know this isn't simple, but I'm not willing to keep ignoring what's happening between us." The tension that had been building for weeks, ever since they first started working together, finally broke. Brandon leaned down, his hand gently resting on her arm as his lips brushed against hers. The kiss was tentative at first, testing the waters, but it quickly deepened as they both gave in to the emotions they had been holding back for too long. Lisa responded, her hands reaching up to rest on his shoulders, pulling him closer. It wasn't just a kiss. It was the culmination of every unspoken word, every shared glance, every heated exchange. The air between them was charged with emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks, and now they were finally free to express them. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless. Lisa's heart was racing, and her mind was spinning. Brandon, I don't even know what to say. Brandon smiled, his thumb brushing lightly over her cheek. You don't have to say anything right now. I just needed you to know how I feel. Lisa smiled back, though her mind was still full of questions. This is going to complicate things, isn't it? Probably, Brandon said, laughing softly, but I think it's worth it. Before they could say anything more, Brandon's phone buzzed loudly on his desk, pulling them back to reality. He sighed and glanced at the screen. It was Jake, and from the tone of the text, it was urgent. I have to take this, Brandon said reluctantly, his hand lingering on hers for a moment longer. Lisa nodded, stepping back as the moment between them slipped away. It's okay. We'll talk later. Brandon grabbed his phone and answered it, his expression shifting back to business as he spoke with Jake. All right, I'll be there in 10. As he hung up, he turned back to Lisa, his eyes softening again. Jake's got something new lined up. It might be the backup plan we've been waiting for. Lisa felt a flicker of hope, but also a sense of uncertainty. I hope so, Brandon. I really do. He walked toward the door, but paused before leaving. We're not done with this conversation, Lisa. I meant what I said. Lisa watched him leave, her heart still pounding from the kiss and the weight of everything that had just happened. Things between them had undeniably shifted, and she wasn't sure what that would mean for the future. But one thing was clear. Her feelings for Brandon were no longer something she could push aside. Chapter 13. Lisa's nerves were still buzzing after the kiss with Brandon the previous night. It wasn't just a kiss. It was the culmination of weeks of tension, shared moments, and unspoken feelings. As much as she wanted to focus on the positive, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a lot more complicated. Arriving early at Eastvale United's headquarters, Lisa tried to concentrate, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Brandon. The boardroom meeting Jake had arranged weighed on her. Unusually, Brandon had invited her to join, as it was related to a new potential sponsorship. After everything with Ruby Roll, he thought it might be a good idea for her to be aware of the next deal on the table. Her anxiety only deepened when Brandon walked in, looking composed as he finished a conversation on his cell phone. Before Lisa could say anything, the door swung open again, and in walked Selena Carrington. The room seemed to shift with her presence, her confident stride and sharp gaze immediately commanding attention. Lisa's stomach tightened as she took in the sight of Brandon's ex, the woman who had once been not only his business partner, but also deeply intertwined in his life. Selena's smile was polite but cool, and as her eyes briefly flicked to Lisa, there was a tension in the air that was impossible to ignore. Brandon's ex and former business partner, Selena, had played a pivotal role in helping him broker the deal when he purchased Eastvale United. Her sharp business instincts and strategic connections were instrumental in navigating the complex negotiations. However, their personal relationship had been just as complicated as their professional one, and while they had parted ways romantically, it seemed Selena wasn't quite ready to let go of her involvement with either the club or Brandon. Despite the end of their relationship, her presence lingered, and her continued interest in the club hinted that she still had a stake in his world, whether he liked it or not. Lisa's heart dropped. She hadn't expected this. Selena strode into the room with all the poise and confidence of someone who knew how to command attention. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, immediately locked onto Brandon, sending a clear message. Their history wasn't just in the past. Brandon, Selena greeted with a cool smile. Surprised to see me? Brandon's face flickered with surprise, though he quickly masked it with a neutral expression. Selena, I didn't realize you'd be handling the sponsorship negotiations. Surprise! Selena replied smoothly, her gaze briefly flicking to Lisa. I've been busy here in the UK, actually. Spoke to another club just last week about a very similar deal, so you might want to hear me out. Lisa's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a business deal. It was leverage. Selena was making it clear that if Brandon didn't play ball, she had other options. The room felt colder as Selena took her seat at the head of the table, and as she began outlining the deal, Lisa struggled to focus on the words. Instead, her mind raced, recalling the gossip she'd overheard from her contacts at Eastvale. Selena had been in the UK for days, but no one had mentioned it to Brandon. The more Lisa thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Selena knew exactly what she was doing, and her presence wasn't just about business, it was personal. So this is a deal with Stream Vision, Selena continued, her voice laced with assurance. They're not just offering sponsorship. They want a full-scale documentary series, a behind-the-scenes look at Eastvale United. The kind of exposure that could put the club on the global map. Jake, who had been silent until now, leaned forward, visibly excited. This could be huge, exactly what we need after Ruby Roll fell through. The mention of Ruby Roll stung. Lisa had seen that deal's impact. Fans were furious, and the community had lost trust. Selena, of course, picked up on the tension. You know, it's a shame about Ruby Roll, Selena said, her eyes glinting. That deal was never right for Eastvale, but with my offer, we can set things straight. It wasn't just a comment on the failed sponsorship, it was a dig. Selena knew all about Lisa's opposition to Ruby Roll, and she was subtly implying she was better for both the club and for Brandon. Lisa's stomach churned. The woman was a master at playing this game. So, Brandon, what do you think? Selena asked, leaning back in her chair, her gaze never leaving him. You've always made smart decisions in the past. I'm sure this one won't be any different. Brandon glanced at the documents in front of him, his expression unreadable. It's a big deal, he said carefully. I need to think it over. Selena's smile never wavered. Of course, take your time. But just remember, no one knows you like I do. I want what's best for you, Brandon, for old time's sake. The insinuation hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Lisa felt her breath catch. The way Selena looked at Brandon, it was as though she still had a claim on him. The history between them wasn't just about business, and Selena wasn't hiding it. Chapter 14. Brandon sat at the head of the boardroom table, hands clasped in front of him, but his thoughts were scattered. Selena Carrington, of all people, was back in his life, and not just as a casual acquaintance. No, she was the broker for the deal that could change everything for Eastvale United. And with her came an unsettling reminder of their past. As Selena presented the details of the Stream Vision sponsorship, Brandon's mind drifted. The numbers were good, better than anything they had seen in months. The idea of a behind-the-scenes documentary that could elevate the club's profile globally was brilliant, but there was something off. It wasn't just the deal. It was Selena herself. Her presence had stirred up emotions he thought he'd buried long ago. She had always been good at navigating the business world, brokering deals, and maintaining a facade of charm and sophistication. But underneath, there had always been more. And now, she was using that same charm to try and reignite something between them. Brandon glanced at Lisa, who was sitting at the far end of the table, trying to mask her discomfort. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers twitched subtly against the edge of her notepad. She wasn't just concerned about the deal. She was concerned about him and Selena. It didn't help that Selena had been dropping subtle hints about their past since the moment she walked in. So, Brandon, Selena's voice cut through his thoughts, I think this partnership could be exactly what Eastvale needs. And of course, I want to see you succeed. Brandon felt a chill run down his spine at the way he met her gaze, and there it was. That familiar look she used to give him, the one that made it clear she wanted more than just a business arrangement. He couldn't let her think that she still had any hold over him, but he also couldn't deny the importance of this deal for the club. His emotions were a tangled mess, and the last thing he needed was for Lisa to get the wrong idea. He cleared his throat. I appreciate the offer, Selena, but I'll need time to review the details. Of course, she replied, her smile never faltering. I'm sure you'll make the right decision for both the club and yourself. Brandon could feel Lisa's eyes on him, and he hated that Selena's words made it sound like there was more between them than there actually was. He had to stay professional, but it wasn't easy when Selena was clearly using this deal to try to manipulate him. After the meeting ended, Selena lingered as the others filed out. Lisa was the last to leave, glancing over her shoulder at Brandon before stepping into the hallway. Once they were alone, Selena moved closer, her voice softening. "You know, Brandon, I've always believed in you. This deal, it's more than just business. We could make a great team again." There it was, the line he had been waiting for. Selena wasn't just here for the club, she was here for him, and she was trying to use their history to pull him back in. Brandon clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. "Selena, this is strictly business," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not the same person I was back then." She raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Are you sure about that? From where I'm standing, it doesn't look like much has changed." Brandon took a step back, putting more distance between them. "I've moved on, and you should too." Selena's smile faltered for the briefest moment before she recovered. "I'll let you think about it," she said lightly. "But just remember, I have other options. There are other clubs interested in what I'm offering." He knew that was her way of reminding him that if he didn't agree, the deal could slip through his fingers and potentially into the hands of a rival club. But he couldn't let her use that as leverage. He had to think about the future of Eastvale, not just his past with Selena. As she turned to leave, she glanced over her shoulder and said, almost as an afterthought, "Oh, and Brandon, it's nice to see you with someone. Lisa, isn't it? I'm sure she's a good distraction." Brandon's blood ran cold. She knew. Of course she knew. She always had her ear to the ground, and she had a knack for gathering information. But it was the way she said it that unsettled him the most. The implication that Lisa was just a passing fancy, a temporary distraction from the real world. As the door clicked shut behind Selena, Brandon's thoughts whirled. He had to distance himself from her, not just for his own sake, but for the sake of his relationship with Lisa. He couldn't afford to let Selena get in the way of what was starting to build between them. But with the club's future at stake, he couldn't afford to let this deal fall through either. For the first time in a long time, Brandon felt truly torn between his heart and his head. Chapter 15. Lisa stood near the edge of the large conference hall, her glass of sparkling water growing warm in her hand. The Eastvale United networking event was buzzing with conversation as representatives from major broadcasting companies, key figures from the Professional Football League, and all the senior staff from the club mingled. It was an important night, one that could secure crucial deals for the future of Eastvale United. But instead of feeling part of the excitement, Lisa felt like an outsider. Her eyes inevitably drifted to Brandon and Selena. Selena was commanding the room, effortlessly engaging with the heads of broadcasting companies and league officials, her every move calculated and graceful. She leaned into Brandon as they spoke, whispering something that made him smile, and Lisa felt her heart sink. Selena wasn't just good at what she did, she was a master at navigating this world. A world Lisa wasn't sure she belonged to. Selena had brokered the deal that allowed Brandon to buy Eastvale United, so of course she knew all the right people, including the senior executives from Streamvision, the broadcasting company she represented. As Lisa watched Selena move through the room, it became clear that she wasn't just making deals. She was reminding everyone of her influence. And then there was Jake. He stood not far from Brandon, talking to a group of executives from MaxStream, a major rival to Streamvision. Lisa watched him with a mixture of admiration and unease. Jake looked so comfortable, so at ease in this high-stakes environment, acting as Brandon's right-hand man. He handled the executives with the same smooth professionalism as Selena, and Lisa couldn't help but feel even more out of place. Where Lisa had built relationships with local businesses, organized community events, and helped keep the club connected to its roots, Selena was playing an entirely different game. She was rubbing shoulders with the people who had the power to shape Eastvale United's future on a much larger scale. Every glance she threw Lisa's way felt like a reminder. This is my world, not yours. Lisa tried to shake off her growing insecurities, but every time Selena leaned closer to Brandon, laughing at something he said, or when Jake smoothly navigated a conversation with the Maxstream executives, it chipped away at her confidence. This wasn't her arena. These weren't her people. As Selena moved to another group, Lisa watched helplessly as she charmed more league officials and key figures in the room. Selena's easy familiarity with these people, the way she commanded attention and effortlessly brought up her role in helping Brandon secure the club, made Lisa feel small. Where Lisa was comfortable with local business owners, Selena knew how to sway those much higher up, and it showed. The worst part was, Selena didn't just engage Brandon professionally. There was something personal in the way she interacted with him, something familiar. Each time Selena whispered in Brandon's ear, each time she touched his arm casually, it reminded Lisa of the history they shared, a history she would never be part of. Jake, meanwhile, was thriving. His calm, confident demeanor made it clear that he was just as comfortable in this environment as Selena. He moved between groups, handling questions and discussing potential deals with ease. Even the Maxstream executives, serious contenders for a streaming deal, seemed captivated by his charm. But Lisa? She felt more out of place with every passing second. Selena caught Lisa's eye from across the room and offered a brief smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. It was the same knowing smile as before, a subtle reminder that Lisa wasn't part of this world, that Selena knew the people who mattered here and had the power to influence them. Lisa quickly looked away, her heart racing. It was all too much. The way Selena dominated the event, the way she leaned into Brandon, whispering things that made him laugh, the easy way she reminded everyone of her role in securing the club, it all felt suffocating. Selena's final glance, a smug look that spoke volumes, was the breaking point. Lisa couldn't take it anymore. The weight of the room, the high-stakes deals, and the ease with which Brandon, Jake, and Selena navigated this world, it all felt like a world Lisa didn't belong to. Without a word, she slipped out of the hall, her pulse quickening as she moved toward the exit. She didn't want anyone to see the tears that were threatening to spill from her eyes, least of all Brandon or Selena. As she stepped into the cool night air, Lisa felt the crushing weight of her doubts settle in. She had tried to convince herself that she could fit into this world, that her relationship with Brandon meant something. But after tonight, after seeing how Selena moved so effortlessly through his world, it was clear. Lisa didn't belong. She wiped at her eyes, determined not to let the tears fall. But the pain was overwhelming. She had let herself believe that she and Brandon could be something real, something beyond business. But after watching him with Selena tonight, seeing how easily she fit into his life and how out of place Lisa felt in her own, it all seemed like a cruel joke. I've been played, Lisa thought, the realization settling in painfully. I don't belong in his world, and I never will. Lisa stood outside as she tried to steady her breathing. The lights from the event behind her felt too bright, too distant, as if she were miles away from the life she had just left behind. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring down at the pavement, desperate to escape the flood of emotions overwhelming her. Then she heard footsteps behind her. He must have noticed she was gone. He must have realized something was wrong and had followed her to explain. To reassure her, the footsteps were quick and purposeful, coming closer, and she imagined the look of concern on his face as he reached out to stop her. But as the sound grew louder, unease crept in. The rhythm was off, too light, too deliberate. Lisa turned, her heart sinking as she saw not Brandon, but Selena standing there, a smug smile playing on her lips. "Leaving so soon, Lisa?" Selena asked, her voice sweet with a hint of mockery. Lisa straightened, forcing herself to hold her composure. "I needed some air," she replied, her voice steady but tense. Selena took a step closer, folding her arms as if savoring the moment. "I couldn't help but notice you left in a bit of a hurry. I thought you might need some company." Her eyes glinted with satisfaction. "It can be tough, can't it? Trying to fit in." Lisa's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm, unwilling to give Selena the reaction she so clearly wanted. "I'm fine," she said, though the words felt hollow. Selena's smile widened, sharp as ever. "Good, because everyone inside seems to be having such a wonderful time. Brandon and I are on fire in there, working the room just like we've done for many years now." She paused, letting the words linger in the air, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. Lisa's throat tightened, but she said nothing, refusing to let Selena's words unravel her. "We had some truly unforgettable times together," Selena continued, her voice dipping into a more personal tone. "I was just telling him how much I missed those days. The romantic getaways, the nights spent in places where no one could find us. There was the south of France, Italy, and Santorini. We were so inseparable back then." Lisa's stomach churned, but she stayed rooted to the spot, unwilling to let Selena see how deeply her words hurt. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep her composure. "And you know," Selena continued, her voice turning casual, almost bored, "when the Stream Vision deal goes through, Brandon and I will be working very closely together. I'll be at the club all the time. We'll probably even take some time away to celebrate. Just the two of us, like old times." Selena's gaze sharpened as she leaned in slightly. "It's inevitable, Lisa. I always get what I want. That's why I'm standing next to Brandon now. And you're out here." Her voice was dripping with satisfaction, the final blow aimed directly at Lisa's heart. It was a cruel truth that hit Lisa hard. She felt the weight of Selena's words crashing down on her, each one more painful than the last. But somehow, she managed to maintain her composure, even as her emotions threatened to tear her apart from the inside. Lisa couldn't say anything, couldn't let herself break in front of Selena. So instead, she turned away, walking quickly toward the street as Selena's words echoed in her mind. As soon as she was out of sight, she hailed a cab, her vision blurred by the tears she had fought so hard to hold back. By the time the cab pulled up in front of Clara's house, Lisa felt drained, emotionally shattered. She knocked on the door, and when Clara opened it, the concern on her face was immediate. "Lisa?" Clara said softly, pulling her inside and into a warm embrace. "What happened?" Lisa's voice cracked as she tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she buried her face in her friend's shoulder, letting the tears she had been holding back finally fall. Chapter 16. Lisa stood in Clara's kitchen, nursing a cup of tea, feeling utterly drained. The weight of the night had settled into her bones, and despite Clara's gentle reassurances, the ache of Selena's words still lingered. Lisa had thought she could hold her own against Selena's barbs, but each one had landed deeper than she anticipated. Clara leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her friend with concern. "So, you're telling me that Selena actually cornered you outside?" Lisa nodded, her fingers tightening around the warm ceramic mug. "Yeah, and she didn't waste any time twisting the knife. She talked about how they've worked together for years, and how they're probably going to celebrate the Stream Vision deal together. It was..." Lisa's voice cracked slightly, but she swallowed hard, determined to keep her composure. "It was like she was reminding me of how much I don't belong in his world." Clara's eyes softened. She moved closer, wrapping an arm around Lisa's shoulders. "She's just playing her games, Lisa. She's trying to make you feel small because she's threatened. That's all." "Yeah, but what if she's right? I mean, look at her, Clara. She's the type of woman who can charm broadcasters and league officials without breaking a sweat. Me? I've spent the last year organizing local events and working with small businesses. It's not the same." Lisa shook her head, her voice thick with frustration. "I don't fit in with people like her, or people like Brandon." Clara squeezed her shoulder. "Don't let her get in your head. You have your own strengths, Lisa. You've built something real with Brandon, something deeper than the business deals and social circles she's using to manipulate him. That's why she's trying so hard to tear you down. But Brandon, he didn't come after me. He stayed with her in there, and I just..." Lisa bit her lip, stopping herself before the tears could rise again. Clara sighed and moved to face Lisa directly, taking the cup from her hands and placing it on the counter. "Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. You need to confront how you feel about Brandon, and not let Selena mess with your head. She doesn't have the power over him that she wants you to believe." Lisa inhaled deeply, staring at the floor. "I don't know if I can face him. What if? What if he is still tied to her? What if I'm just..." Clara's voice turned firm, cutting through her friend's doubts. "What if he's not? What if Brandon is just as torn up about this as you are? You won't know until you talk to him. Hiding here and letting Selena's words fester won't help. You need to get answers from Brandon and find out where his heart really lies. Lisa blinked up at her, absorbing the truth of Clara's words. As much as she wanted to hide, Clara was right. Running away wasn't going to make this any easier. She needed to know where she stood, and the only way to do that was to face Brandon and finally ask the questions she'd been too afraid to confront. "Okay," Lisa whispered, her voice steadier now. "I'll talk to him." Clara smiled, her expression gentle but approving. "Good. And remember, no matter what happens, you're strong enough to handle it." Lisa nodded, feeling the warmth of her friend's support anchor her. The doubts that had haunted her for so long were still there, but they didn't feel quite as overwhelming. She knew what she had to do. It was time to stop running. Chapter 17. Lisa sat in the quiet stands of Eastvale United Stadium, the world around her still and empty. It had been 2 days since the disastrous networking event. 2 days since Selena had cornered her and shattered her confidence. 2 days of avoiding Brandon, ignoring his calls, and battling with the growing ache in her chest. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pitch, and later tonight, Brandon would be announcing the new media deal. The thought made Lisa's stomach churn. She didn't know if she could bear to see him make that announcement, knowing it meant working closely with Selena. She looked down when she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. Her heart twisted as she saw Brandon walking toward her, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. It was the first time they'd seen each other since that night, and Lisa felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. "Lisa," Brandon said softly as he reached her, sitting down a few feet away on the bench. "I've been trying to talk to you." Lisa didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the empty field in front of her. "I know." He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. "We need to talk. I know things have been complicated with Selena, but I need you to hear me out." Lisa's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't want to hear more about Selena. She didn't want to be reminded of how deep her history with Brandon ran. Brandon continued, sensing her hesitation. "Selena, she's been manipulative, and I should have made that clearer from the start. She's been trying to use her position to cause trouble between us. But I need you to understand that she's played a significant role in the club's commercial direction. I couldn't just push her out of the picture without..." "Without what?" Lisa snapped, finally turning to face him, her eyes blazing. "Without losing a deal? Without risking your precious business?" She stood abruptly, feeling her anger rise. "So what, Brandon? You needed her around because she's been so vital to your business? She's been a part of everything, hasn't she?" Brandon stood as well, his expression tense. "It's not like that. Yes, she's had a hand in the commercial side of things, but that doesn't mean..." "It doesn't mean what?" Lisa cut him off, her voice rising. "That it doesn't matter? That I shouldn't care? You think I don't see what's happening here? You've been keeping her close because she's good for the club. But what about me, Brandon? What about how I feel?" Brandon's jaw tightened. "Lisa, my feelings for Selena are in the past. She doesn't mean anything to me anymore." Lisa scoffed, crossing her arms. "Except she clearly still has an important place in your world. I'm just an afterthought, aren't I? I'm the one on the outside, while she's been right there with you the entire time, pulling the strings." Her voice broke, and she turned away, blinking back tears. "You let her manipulate everything, Brandon, and now I'm the one who's left feeling like I don't belong." "Lisa, wait," Brandon said, his tone urgent. He stepped closer, trying to reach for her, but she pulled away. "I knew this would happen," Lisa whispered, more to herself than to him. "From the beginning, I knew I didn't stand a chance against someone like her. She's always been part of your world, powerful, confident, and completely at ease in the circles you run in. And her voice cracked. "I never should have let myself fall for you." Brandon's face fell, and he reached out again. "Lisa, that's not true. I care about you. It's you I want." But Lisa shook her head, stepping back. "No, Brandon, you've made your choice. You chose her when you let her stay involved, when you didn't push her out of the club. You let her make me feel like I didn't matter." "Lisa, Please, Brandon pleaded, but she didn't give him a chance to finish. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her heart shattering with each step. She couldn't bear to stay and hear more. The moment felt final, and deep down, Lisa knew she had never stood a chance against Selena. Chapter 18. Lisa sat in the front row, her heart heavy with dread. Clara, sitting next to her, gave her a concerned glance, but Lisa couldn't tear her eyes away from the stage. Today was the day Brandon would announce the new sponsorship deal, one that Lisa feared was tied to Selena and Streamvision. She didn't want to believe it, but everything had been pointing toward it. Selena had made her presence at the club all too clear, and Lisa felt the sting of helplessness every time she saw her around Brandon. Clara leaned over. "You okay?" Lisa nodded stiffly. "I'm fine." But she wasn't. The room buzzed with excitement, reporters and club officials filling every seat. The sound of cameras clicking echoed through the space as the lights dimmed, signaling the start of the event. Clara got up to use the bathroom, leaving Lisa alone with her spiraling thoughts. As soon as Clara left, Lisa felt a presence beside her. She turned to find Selena slipping into the seat next to her, a smile of quiet victory playing on her lips. "Exciting, isn't it?" Selena said, her voice oozing with confidence. "Brandon's about to make an announcement that will change the future of Eastvale United forever. I can't wait to start working more closely with him." Lisa clenched her jaw, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. The reminder that Selena had been working on this deal for weeks felt like a punch to the gut. Before Lisa could respond, Brandon walked out onto the stage, the crowd quieting instantly. He looked composed, every bit the polished businessman he had become. But as his gaze briefly flickered toward Lisa, she saw something else, something softer, more personal. "Good evening, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here today to share some exciting news about the future of Eastvale United." Brandon began, his voice strong and steady. "We've been working hard behind the scenes to secure a sponsorship deal that not only benefits the club, but also aligns with our core values and commitment to the community." Lisa held her breath as Brandon continued, her stomach twisting in knots. She braced herself for the inevitable mention of Streamvision and the future Brandon would be building with Selena at his side. "I'd like to start by thanking Selena Carrington for her hard work on behalf of Streamvision," Brandon said, and Lisa's heart dropped. Selena has played an important role in shaping the commercial direction of the club, and we're grateful for her efforts. Selena shot Lisa a triumphant glance, her smirk widening as Brandon continued. "Streamvision presented an incredible opportunity, one that would certainly have propelled the club forward, and I'd like to acknowledge their contribution to this process." Brandon paused, the room filled with anticipation. Then he looked directly at Lisa. "But as I considered what's truly right for Eastvale, for its people, and for the fans who make this club what it is, I realized that sometimes the right decision isn't the easiest one." Lisa blinked, her heart pounding as Brandon's words began to sink in. What was he doing? "Lisa has helped me see that the future of Eastvale United isn't just about commercial success. It's about staying true to the values this club was built on," Brandon continued, his voice growing more personal. "And it's with that in mind that I'm proud to announce a new partnership, not with Streamvision, but with MaxStream, a company that shares our vision for putting the community first." The room erupted into a flurry of whispers and camera flashes. Lisa's head spun as she tried to process what had just happened. MaxStream? Not Streamvision? Her pulse quickened as she looked toward the stage, where Brandon was still speaking. Not only will MaxStream be sponsoring Eastvale United, but they have also agreed to fund and operate a fan-led online channel, giving the fans a direct voice in the future of this club, Brandon announced, the room now buzzing with excitement. He then gestured to the back of the room. "I'd like to introduce you all to Steve Harris, the head of the Eastvale Supporters Fan Forum. His passion for this club is unmatched, and I look forward to working closely with him as we take this next step together." As Steve stood to applause, Lisa felt a rush of emotion. This wasn't just a sponsorship announcement. This was a statement. Brandon had listened. He had chosen something that aligned with the heart of Eastvale, with the community. Beside her, Selena's smile had frozen into something more brittle, her eyes narrowing as she realized what had just happened. She leaned closer to Lisa, her voice sharp. Don't think this changes anything. Brandon still needs me. This club still needs Stream Vision. But Lisa didn't respond. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of relief. Brandon had made his choice. And it wasn't Selena's world of polished deals and facades. It was the world Lisa had always been a part of. As Brandon stepped off the stage, he caught Lisa's eye again, his expression soft. The room swirled around them, but in that moment, Lisa knew he wasn't just making decisions for the club. He was making decisions for them. The applause from the audience was still echoing through the room as Steve stepped onto the stage. His easy grin and laid-back demeanor immediately lightened the atmosphere. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and then glanced toward the front row where Lisa and Brandon sat. Well, I wasn't expecting to be up here today, Steve started, his voice warm and confident, drawing chuckles from the crowd. But when Brandon called me up and said he wanted to meet, I couldn't believe it. I thought I was in trouble or something. A ripple of laughter passed through the room, and Steve continued with a playful shrug. He invited me and the lads down to the Cleves Arms, and I'm thinking, what's a guy like him doing calling me personally to head down to the pub? But there we were, me, Gary, Neil, Brandon, Jake, and a couple of the guys from Maxstream, sitting at the corner table, talking and laughing as if we were old mates. Lisa couldn't help but smile as Steve recounted the night. She caught Brandon's eye, and he gave her a subtle, knowing nod. Now, Steve went on, his grin widening, I have to tell you, Brandon made us pay for the first round of drinks. He said he was a bit skint after paying $300 million for Eastvale. I reminded Brandon that Eastvale is in the UK, so he wouldn't have paid in dollars, he would have paid in pounds sterling. The crowd erupted into laughter, and even Lisa found herself laughing despite the tension she'd been feeling moments earlier. Steve continued, but jokes aside, it was the first time in my lifetime that an owner of this club had actually sat down, proactively, personally, face-to-face, and listened to us. Not just nodding along, but really listening to what we had to say. Steve's voice softened as he looked over at Lisa, his expression sincere. And none of this would have happened without Lisa. She gave us the support we needed to develop the idea for the fan section of the magazine, and that's what inspired all this. The whole idea for the online channel came from that. She made us feel like our voices mattered. And now, thanks to her and Brandon, the fans will have a real voice. Lisa felt a surge of warmth spread through her. Steve's words meant more than she could have anticipated. She'd fought so hard for the community, for the fans, and to see it all come together like this, it was overwhelming in the best possible way. Instead of reading a magazine, Steve continued, the fans will now have the chance to broadcast their opinions, share their stories, and will even get regular access to the Players' Lounge for exclusive interviews with the team. The crowd murmured excitedly, clearly impressed with the new initiative. He paused for a moment, looking back at Brandon with a cheeky grin. Oh, and just so you all know, apart from their accents, Brandon and Jake fit right in with the locals down at the Cleves Arms. In fact, they said they'd be back next week for karaoke night. Laughter broke out again, the atmosphere light and full of good humor. The moment, however, was quickly interrupted. Lisa noticed Selena rising from her seat, her face a mask of barely contained fury. Without a word, she stormed toward the exit, heels clicking sharply against the floor as she made her way out of the room. The whispers started immediately, but Lisa barely paid them any mind. Selena's departure felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders. The drama, the manipulation, it was all walking out the door with her. Lisa shot a glance at Brandon, who remained calm, though his eyes briefly flicked toward the exit where Selena had just disappeared. His expression didn't falter, but Lisa could tell he was relieved too. Steve, oblivious to the tension, continued with his speech. We'll have our own deals and sponsors coming in, and the best part is that the funds we generate will go toward local projects, things that really matter to the community. It's not just about football anymore. It's about making a real difference, and we couldn't be prouder to be a part of that. The applause was loud and genuine as Steve stepped back, waving to the crowd before leaving the stage. Lisa clapped along, her heart full. Brandon had made the right choice, and she had been a part of something that truly mattered. The future of Eastvale United wasn't just in the hands of business deals or corporate sponsorships anymore. It was in the hands of the community. As the applause for Steve's speech faded, Brandon made his way back to the stage. He gave a nod of thanks to Steve before turning his attention to the audience, a smile playing on his lips. "Well, everything Steve said up here was true," Brandon began, pausing for dramatic effect. "Apart from the bit about me doing karaoke." The room erupted in laughter, and even Lisa couldn't help but chuckle from her seat. She knew Brandon would never willingly subject himself to a karaoke night at the Cleves Arms, no matter how much he'd warmed to the pub and its locals. Brandon continued, his expression softening as he looked toward Lisa. "But in all seriousness, I want to take a moment to thank someone who has taught me more than she realizes. Lisa, you've shown me the importance of listening, not just to the numbers, but to the heart of this community. You've helped me understand what's truly right for Eastvale and right for myself." The audience fell silent, hanging on his every word. Lisa's breath caught as she felt the weight of the moment. She hadn't expected him to speak so personally, and she certainly hadn't expected to be the focus of his speech. Brandon glanced down for a second, shaking his head with a light chuckle before looking back at her. "The funny thing is," he added, "I tried to tell her all of this earlier, but she didn't give me a chance to finish my sentence. She's always one step ahead." Lisa felt her cheeks flush, both from embarrassment and amusement. It was true. She'd been so caught up in her own thoughts earlier that she hadn't let him get a word in. Brandon's tone shifted, becoming more playful as he addressed the room once again. "Now, since Maxstream is already here with their cameras rolling, I figure I might as well give them something good to use in their first episode of the documentary about Eastvale, this great soccer club." He emphasized the word soccer with a grin, knowing full well how much it irked Lisa. The audience chuckled, and Lisa shot him a look, half amused and half annoyed, as if daring him to keep going. But what she didn't expect was what came next. Brandon stepped down from the stage, his eyes never leaving hers as he walked toward her. The entire room went still, all eyes fixed on him. Lisa's heart raced as she watched him approach, her mind struggling to process what was happening. When he reached her, he knelt slightly to be at eye level. "You look stunned," Brandon said with a soft smile. Lisa blinked, trying to catch up. "I'm so angry with you right now." Brandon raised an eyebrow, surprised but amused. "Why?" "Because you keep saying soccer," she said, narrowing her eyes at him. "Eastvale is a football club, not a soccer club." Brandon chuckled, his laughter light and full of affection. "Old habits die hard, I guess." The room filled with more laughter, but then everything seemed to fall away as Brandon's gaze turned serious once again. He took a deep breath before speaking. "I've been trying to call you since that networking event," he said, his voice quieter now, meant just for her. "But you didn't answer, and earlier, when I tried to explain everything, you didn't give me a chance to finish." Lisa frowned slightly, guilt flickering across her face. "I didn't thank you." Brandon held up a hand, stopping her gently. "Let me finish this time." He shifted slightly, still in front of her, his eyes searching hers. "I was trying to contact you to help organize the meeting with Steve and the others at the pub. But when you didn't answer, I had to take care of it myself. I wanted you to be there for every part of this because none of it would have happened without you." Lisa's heart swelled, but before she could respond, Brandon continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Since the night we kissed, everything has been so busy, but it's also been lonely. Every minute we've spent together, I've loved, but the past few days without you have been agony. I don't want to go through that again." The room was silent, every eye on the two of them, but all Lisa could see was Brandon. Her world had narrowed to this moment, his words wrapping around her heart. "You've taught me so much," Brandon said, his voice barely above a whisper now, meant just for her. "You've helped me see what's right. You've helped me see what I truly want from life." Lisa's breath hitched as Brandon's next words tumbled from his lips. "I've fallen in love with you, Lisa," he confessed, his gaze intense and full of vulnerability. "And I don't ever want to be without you again." The room seemed to hold its breath, but Lisa was already rising from her seat, tears brimming in her eyes. She didn't care about the cameras flashing or the crowd watching. All she cared about was the man in front of her, the man who had just laid his heart bare. Without hesitation, she closed the distance between them, her voice trembling but sure. "I love you too, Brandon. I've loved you for a while now." She leaned in, their lips meeting in a kiss that was filled with everything they had both been holding back for too long. The crowd erupted into applause, the cameras flashing wildly, but all that faded into the background. In this moment, nothing else mattered. When they finally pulled apart, Lisa's smile was radiant, her eyes still shimmering with happy tears. "You still have to stop calling it soccer," she teased, her voice shaky but full of affection. Brandon laughed, brushing a thumb across her cheek. "I'll call it anything you want, as long as I have you by my side." Lisa beamed, her heart full. Deal. With that one word, they sealed not just a promise, but a future together. The world around them fading into insignificance as they embraced their happily ever after.
Thank you for listening to this audiobook romance novel by Rebecca Best. Remember to hit the subscribe button to be notified the next time we publish a romance audiobook, and leave us a comment below to let us know what you thought of this story. Ready to dive into another romance audiobook from Rebecca Best? Just click the video on screen now, and I'll see you there.